In today's last hike video, we look at the dumbest ironic deaths while hiking, from a TikTok gullible tourist who saw the Grand Canyon as a backyard path, to fame-hungry influencers who barrel-rolled into Death Valley's blazing oven during an extreme heat warning for a few likes.
It was July 16th, 2022, and the mid-morning sun was already climbing over the south rim of the Grand Canyon. Though the dry desert air up on the rim still felt deceptively easy, the kind of comfortable that fools you into thinking the whole day will feel that way, where a young woman in cute low-top sneakers stood at the lip of a trailhead filming a quick intro clip on her phone before she started down. Aubrey Lindquist was 24 and lived in a suburb outside Minneapolis, where the land is flat and green and humid and sits down near sea level, which matters more than it sounds like it should. Her body had spent its whole life in thick, wet, low air, the kind where you sweat and the sweat sits on your skin, and it had never once had to deal with the kind of bone-dry desert heat she was about to walk into. That matters a lot, because in dry heat, your sweat evaporates so fast you don't even feel wet, so you don't realize how much water you're pouring out of your body every minute. You can be dangerously dehydrated and feel relatively dry and fine, right up until you very suddenly aren't. The thing about being good at making hard things look easy is that after a while, you can start to believe your own footage. That skill is part of what got her down that trail, and it's part of what kept her going past the point where she should have turned around. People who knew her said she was the friend who was always up for a spontaneous trip, the one who'd book a flight on a whim and figure out the details later, which is a wonderful way to live right up until the details are the only thing keeping you alive.
I've watched the content of people exactly like her before, and it's easy to forget how effortless and easy they make it look on video, and it's mostly just good editing on their part.
The whole trip started with one video. A creator Aubrey followed had posted a glossy little clip of herself strolling from the rim all the way down to the Colorado River and back, set to a trending sound, captioned like it was a fun half-day adventure anybody could knock out before lunch. The same creator had a second clip that did even bigger numbers, a hidden off-trail overlook she called her secret spot, this jaw-dropping view tucked away from the main path that racked up millions of views.
There was no mention of heat anywhere in either video. No mention of how much water you actually need, which on a hike like that in the heat is several liters at least, not one cute little bottle.
No mention of when you're supposed to turn around, no mention of the temperature difference between the rim and the bottom, nothing about the fact that the rangers and everyone who works that canyon practically beg visitors not to try to hike to the river and back in a single day. None of the stuff that actually matters, because none of the stuff that actually matters makes for a fun 15-second clip. What you got instead was a pretty girl, a gorgeous view, a trending song, and a vibe that said this is easy, this is doable, this is your sign to book the trip. Aubrey watched it enough times that she basically had the route memorized in her head, or at least she thought she did, which turned out to be a very different thing from actually knowing it. She saved the clip to a little trip folder on her phone and rewatched it on the drive in. She texted a friend that she was just going to do the easy famous one everybody does and grab the secret spot photo while she was at it. And that was the plan in her head. A cute hike, a couple of incredible photos, back to the car by early afternoon. The canyon had a very different plan, and the enormous gap between those two things, between the cute hike she pictured and the furnace she actually walked into, is the entire story. She wasn't trying to do anything extreme. She wasn't trying to break a record or push any limits. She thought she was doing the safe, normal, popular thing, the one everybody does, and that belief is exactly what made her let her guard all the way down.
I want to be fair to her here. She wasn't reckless per se, she was just trusting the only version of that canyon she'd ever been shown.
A clip like that strips out every single boring detail that would actually keep you alive. The water math, the timing, the heat, because none of that is fun to watch, and what's left is a 15-second daydream that millions of people quietly file away as something they could totally do too. She packed to match the creator almost exactly. One small sling bag, one 24-ounce water bottle, her phone, a portable charger, sunglasses, and the cute low-top sneakers she always wore in her videos because they looked good on camera. No hat, no real food beyond a granola bar or two, no electrolytes, no extra layers, no map beyond the trail she'd seen on her screen. For a flat paved walk around a lake back home, that kit is totally fine. For one of the most punishing day hikes in the entire country, in the middle of July, it's almost nothing.
The park doesn't hand you one simple number. It tells you to carry several liters at a minimum, to drink steadily instead of waiting until you're thirsty, to eat salty snacks so that your body can hold onto that water, to wear a wide hat and real shoes with grip, and honestly, not to try to hike all the way to the river and back in a single summer day at all.
She had a fraction of one of those things. But it matched the video, and in her mind, the video was the instruction manual, so she felt prepared. That's maybe the scariest part of the whole setup, that she genuinely thought she was ready, because the only source she'd checked had told her there was nothing to get ready for.
That single bottle says everything to me. That little bottle, it's the whole gap between the trip that she pictured and the one that she actually got and prepared for.
She also started late. Everyone who knows that canyon will tell you the only safe way to do a big descent in summer is to be moving in the dark before sunrise, and to be back up top before the worst of the afternoon. But the video had been filmed in soft, pretty light, and Aubrey wanted that same look for her secret spot shot, so she didn't even reach the trailhead until mid-morning. By the time she was lacing up her sneakers at the rim, the sun was already well up and climbing, and all that bare rock was starting to soak in the heat that it would radiate right back at her for the rest of the day, like the inside of an oven. The cool morning window, the only forgiving part of a summer day down there, was already closing behind her before she took her first step. She didn't know that's what was happening. To her, it just felt like a nice, warm, sunny morning, perfect light for filming, the day getting started a little later than planned, but no big deal. At the trailhead, there were signs. There are always signs, and they are not subtle. Stacked warnings about how hiking to the river and back in one day is strongly discouraged, about how the heat down in the canyon kills people, real blunt language with little graphics of a hiker in distress, the kind of signage that exists specifically because so many people have died doing exactly what she was about to do.
Aubrey did glance at them.
There was even one specifically aimed at young, fit-looking hikers, basically saying that being young and in shape does not protect you down here, that the people this canyon takes are very often exactly the confident ones who feel great on the way down.
She skimmed them the way a lot of people do and decided they were meant for tourists who didn't really know what they were getting into, not for someone young and fit and capable like her, so she filed them away and kept moving.
The video had already told her this was a fun, easy thing, and a wall of scary words and distressed hiker graphics just did not match the bright little daydream she'd packed for.
Those signs were basically a description of her exact plan, and it stuns me that she read straight past every single line.
The trouble is that a warning sign and a 15-second video are not a fair fight. The sign is static and grim and easy to read as something meant for other people, the unfit, the unprepared, the ones who supposedly do not know what they are doing, and Aubrey did not see herself as any of those. The video was bright and moving and full of a real person who looked just like her, doing the exact thing and loving every second of it, and it had been playing in her head for weeks. One of those things had her full attention and the easy trust she handed to the people she followed online, and the other was just a sign by a trail she was already walking past. By the time those warnings might have mattered, the video had already won, the way it almost always does. The way down felt amazing, and that's the cruel trick of this place. Going down is easy. It's all downhill. The morning air higher up still had a little coolness to it, and every switchback opened up another view that looked exactly like the ones that had pulled her here in the first place. She filmed as she went, narrating little clips, feeling strong and light and completely vindicated, like all the worry online was overblown and she'd been right to just go for it. Her legs felt great. Her one little bottle was already running low, but she wasn't worried about it in the slightest because she still felt strong, and the video had made the whole thing look so casual that running out just didn't seem like a real possibility. She passed a few other hikers heading up who looked absolutely wrecked, red-faced and soaked through and moving in that slow, grinding shuffle of people who are running on empty, and she didn't really clock what that meant. To her, they were just out-of-shape people having a rough day. She didn't understand that she was looking at her own near future, that those people were paying the exact bill she hadn't even started running up yet. She gave a couple of them a cheerful little hello and kept bounding down, feeling like proof that the whole thing was easier than people made it out to be.
I know that floaty downhill feeling so well, the one whispering, "This is easy," and out here, it's the most expensive lie there is.
What your body doesn't tell you on the way down is that every single one of those easy downhill steps is a step you are going to have to climb back up later, in far worse heat with far less in the tank. The canyon flips the normal rule of hiking completely upside down. On a normal hike, you climb up first while you're fresh and strong, then you get the easy downhill on the way home when you're tired. Here, it's backwards. The easy part comes first and lies right to your face, and the hard part, the long climb, waits for you at the very bottom at the very hottest part of the day, exactly when you have the least left to give. Aubrey went down feeling unstoppable, and because she felt that good, she went down a lot further than she'd ever planned to, chasing views and that easy floaty feeling, never once stopping to picture herself doing every one of those steps in reverse, uphill, in the heat, on an empty bottle. When you feel that strong, it is almost impossible to imagine feeling any other way, and the canyon knows that about people, and it waits. And the deeper she went, the more the canyon rewarded her for it. The light kept shifting on the rock walls. The views kept opening up into something even bigger than the last one, and every few minutes there was another frame worth stopping for. She was narrating little clips to her phone, telling whoever would watch later how unreal it all was, how she could not believe more people did not just do this. Her body felt loose and strong and capable in a way that made the whole idea of danger feel like something that happened to other, less careful people. That feeling, the easy strength of going downhill in the early part of the day, is the single most expensive feeling in that entire canyon, because it is borrowed against a climb she had not begun to think about yet.
It messes with me that the easy part comes first, because by the time the canyon shows its teeth, you've already spent everything.
By the time she got all the way down into the lower canyon and out toward the river, the temperature had climbed in a way that didn't feel real to someone from a place where a hot day means the mid-80s. Down low, boxed in by all that dark rock, soaking up the sun and throwing the heat right back at her from every direction, it can easily run 20 degrees hotter than it is up on the rim. So even on a day that felt hot but totally manageable up on top, down at the bottom, it was a different world entirely. While the people up on the rim were having a warm but survivable afternoon, Aubrey had basically descended into a furnace, step by step, feeling fine the whole way down because going down is easy, and the worst of the heat builds slowly enough that you don't notice it cooking you until you try to do something hard. She got down to the water, got her photos, dipped her feet in, and sat in one of the rare patches of real shade to rest, and that's where she felt the first little flickers of something being off. A headache starting up behind her eyes. A heart rate that wouldn't fully settle even though she was sitting completely still. A kind of tiredness that felt heavier than it should have for someone who'd only gone downhill so far. She didn't think much of it, she just figured she was hot and needed a rest, which is exactly what nearly everyone thinks right before things go bad out there. She drank the rest of her water down at the river because she was thirsty and it was right there and her brain wasn't doing the math on what came next. The bottle that was supposed to get her all the way back up to the rim was now basically empty. What she had no clue about, because the video had never once shown it, was that down near the river along the main corridor, there was actually drinkable water and a ranger station, real help that might have changed everything. And the off-trail detour she was about to take would pull her away from all of it before she ever stumbled onto it.
Her drinking the last of her water at the lowest, hottest point of the route is the part that I had to read twice.
There's a rule serious hikers live by out there, that you turn around once you've used up about a third of your water and your energy, because you have to save the bigger share for the climb out. Aubrey had never heard that rule in her life. The video never said it, none of the captions mentioned it, nobody had pulled her aside and told her, and so she sailed right past the most important moment of her entire day without ever knowing the moment was even there. She had already used up way more than a third of everything. Her water was gone, her energy was fading, and by the real rules of that canyon, she was already in trouble. She just felt fine enough to not realize it yet.
It haunts me a bit that the single most important call of her day was one that nobody ever told her that she was supposed to make.
And then, instead of starting the long climb back out while she still had even a little bit left in her, she decided she still had time for the secret spot. That photo was half the reason she'd driven all this way. The shot that had pulled millions of views for the creator she followed, the one that would have been the centerpiece of her whole trip. And she was so close, or at least she thought she was. She pulled up the saved clip one more time, studied the rock formations in the background, tried to match them up to the shapes around her, and made the call that quietly turned a dangerous situation into a fatal one. She stepped off the maintained trail to go find a spot she'd only ever seen on a screen. If there's 1 second of this whole story I'd reach back through time to stop, it's the step that she took off that trail. Leaving that trail was the point of no return, even though it absolutely did not feel like it at the time. This was not some marathon wandering search. She had a rough idea of where the spot should be and set off straight toward it, but off the maintained path, the canyon turns into a different kind of trap. There was no shade out there at all. No other people, no trail markers, nothing but rock and sun and silence. And this is the moment the heat she had been shrugging off all the way down finally forced itself on her. Her head was pounding now, her shirt was soaked through, her heart would not slow down, and every short scramble over the broken ground took more out of her than it had any right to, because she was doing it on a body with no water left in it. Even people with maps and proper training and plenty of water have lost their bearings out here, where every ridge and dry wash looks exactly like the one beside it. So a first-timer from Minnesota working off the memory of a video had very little margin for even the few minutes she spent picking her way across it. And the spot, the whole reason she had left the safety of the trail, did not look anything like it had on her screen, because a place filmed in soft light at the right angle almost never does once you are standing in it, overheating and squinting and starting to feel genuinely unwell. It did not take her long to give it up, but the short detour had done its quiet damage all the same. It had pulled her off the corridor and away from the water and the ranger stations she never knew were there, and it had taken a real bite out of the little time and energy she had left. By the time the photo stopped mattering to her, the canyon had quietly collected most of what she had, and she had not even started the part that actually kills people.
I picture her out there alone, turning in circles with a dead phone and a saved video that suddenly couldn't help her at all.
By the time she turned back toward the main trail, she was nearly out of everything, shaky and overheating, and the hottest part of the afternoon was only just getting started. I hate that she gave up the photo a beat too late, after the canyon had already taken what she needed to climb out. The climb is where the canyon collects what it's owed. By now, it was well into the afternoon, and the heat deep in the canyon was somewhere north of 110 degrees, the kind of heat that is genuinely an emergency for a body that grew up in cool, wet Minnesota air. Aubrey started up with almost nothing left in the tank. No water, no food that mattered, no shade anywhere, and a long, brutal vertical climb of thousands of feet between her and the rim. The same descent that had felt so easy and fun in the morning was now a wall she had to climb in the worst heat of the day. At first, it was just misery. A pounding heart, a churning stomach, legs that felt like they were slowly filling up with wet sand. She kept stopping every few steps, kept telling herself she just needed a second to catch her breath, kept badly underestimating how much trouble she was actually in, because she had spent the entire day being told by a video that this was easy, and her brain kept defaulting back to that. Every time she sat down to rest, she was actually losing ground, because resting in that heat with no water doesn't recharge you. Your core just keeps climbing. The further she climbed, the more her body started sending up signals she had never felt before and did not know how to read. A deep, sloshing nausea, a headache that went from a dull ache to something that pulsed behind her eyes with every heartbeat, cramps knotting up in her calves and her hands. And underneath all of it, for the first time all day, real fear. The slow, creeping understanding that something was genuinely wrong and that she was a very long way from any kind of help. She kept reaching for the bottle out of pure reflex, tilting it back and getting nothing but a warm plastic taste and a few useless drops. She told herself she just had to keep moving, one switchback at a time, but each one was taking longer than the last, and the rim above her never seemed to get any closer at all.
It floors me that effort meant nothing here. You can't push through a body that has run out of the water that it needs to survive and to cool down.
By now, the trail around her had emptied out, because anyone with any sense was either long since back up top or had never dropped down into that furnace in the first place. There was no steady stream of hikers to wave down, no ranger appearing around the next bend, just the odd distant figure far above or below her, much too far away to matter. It was the hottest stretch of the day in the hottest part of the canyon, and she was almost entirely alone in it, with thousands of vertical feet still standing between her and the rim, and a body that had already burned through everything it needed to get up there. Then the scarier stuff started. The stuff that means a body is genuinely overheating from the inside out. The thing most people don't realize about heat at that level is that at a certain point your body actually stops sweating. It just runs out of the water it needs to make sweat, and once you stop sweating, you lose the only real way you have to cool yourself down, and the core temperature starts climbing fast and doesn't stop. That's the line between being miserably hot and being in genuine mortal danger, and Aubrey crossed it somewhere on that climb without ever knowing she had.
There is a cruel mercy in it, in a way, because by the time the heat is doing that to you, it's also taking away your ability to understand that it's even happening.
The part of your brain that should be screaming at you to get help is the part going offline first. She got confused. She started stumbling, taking wrong steps, struggling to track where the trail even was in front of her. The clear thinking that might have told her to flag down help or stay put in one spot was the exact thing the heat was taking from her first. Somewhere in there, she wandered off the route again, this time not chasing a photo, but just desperately looking for shade, looking for relief, looking for anything, and she ended up tucked into a thin sliver of shadow against the rock, off in an area where the few other hikers still out in that heat wouldn't be passing by. Her phone had no signal, the way it hadn't all day. There was no one within earshot to call out to, and the canyon just went quiet and hot and still around her, the way it has around far too many people who walked in trusting that it would be easy.
And it kind of guts me that by the time she stopped, the part of her that should scream for help was the first thing that the heat took.
She didn't come back that evening. Her friend's texts went unanswered. Easy to wave off at first because there is no signal down in the canyon, but when her rental car was found, still sitting in the trailhead lot long after any day hike should have ended, the unease turned into something real. The search began the next morning, and it did not take the team long to recognize a pattern they had walked through too many times. The late start, the river photos, the single empty bottle, the drift off the corridor. They found her in the rough, broken ground where people in deep heat trouble tend to wander looking for shade that isn't there, and by then, there was no rescue left to make. The medical examiner ruled it environmental, heat-related hyperthermia with dehydration a contributing factor, the same ruling written out at that canyon far more often than anyone watching would ever guess. No foul play, nothing criminal, just a young woman whose body could not survive what she had walked into.
I can't make peace that the clip that sent her there is probably still online, captioned like it's nothing at all.
All of it was preventable, and that is the hardest part to sit with. There was a sign at the top that spelled out almost exactly what was going to happen. There was a turnaround rule that would have saved her if she had ever once heard it. There was a version of that day where she carries enough water, skips the secret spot, turns back in time, and walks out tired and sunburned and completely fine with a phone full of nice photos and a good story. That version was available to her the entire time, and a 15-second video made by someone who almost certainly meant no harm had quietly talked her out of every exit ramp, one easy-looking frame at a time. The trip looked easy because somebody made it look easy on purpose. And out there, in that heat, on that climb, looking easy and being easy are two completely different things. It was August 17th, 2019, in Zion National Park, Utah.
I want you to picture something before I get into the story.
Imagine a slot canyon. Red and orange sandstone walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, sunlight spilling through narrow gaps above, and rock sculpted into smooth waves and curves by millions of years of water. It's one of the most photographed places in the American Southwest, and hundreds of thousands of people visit every year and leave with stories about how beautiful it was. But there's another version of the Narrows that rarely appears in those photographs. The version that exists after months without meaningful rain, when temperatures have stayed above 100 degrees for weeks, and the river has dwindled to stagnant pools baking beneath the canyon walls. That's what Ryan and Lauren Chavez walked into.
I want to be clear about something up front. There were no witnesses to most of what happened inside that canyon that day.
What I'm going to walk you through is based on the investigation that followed the physical evidence searchers found, the timeline reconstructed from the couple's movements as best as investigators could determine, and accounts from the two people who encountered them during the hike. Where I'm describing what Ryan and Lauren were likely doing or experiencing, I'm going to tell you that's what investigators believe probably happened, based on everything they were able to piece together. I'm not going to pretend anyone was there watching. Nobody was. That's actually a big part of why this ended the way it did. In August 2019, after months of extreme drought in southern Utah, the Virgin River through Zion's Narrows had shrunk to stagnant, shallow pools. The Narrows, a famous slot canyon hike, typically fed by cold, clear snowmelt, had become dangerously warm and still. Despite clear warning boards at the trailhead listing no flow, stagnant water, and extreme heat hazard, Ryan and Lauren planned the bottom-up hike most visitors imagine from photos, not the drought-altered reality waiting for them. A lot of visitors that summer looked at those boards and made a reasonable decision to skip the Narrows and do something else.
But there's also a particular kind of visitor, and I don't say this to be cruel or anything, because I think most of us have been this visitor at one point or another, who reads a warning and decides it probably doesn't apply to them.
Who figures the rangers are being overly cautious, or that the conditions won't be as bad as described, or that they're fit enough to handle whatever the trail throws at them. Who, in short, decides that the plan doesn't need to change. Ryan Chavez was 31 years old, an HVAC technician from Phoenix, Arizona. He worked with his hands, stayed in shape, hit the gym regularly. He'd done day hikes around Arizona, and he was the kind of guy, people who knew him said, who pushed through discomfort rather than stopping early. That's an admirable quality in a lot of contexts. In a desert canyon in August, it becomes something more complicated. His wife, Lauren Cuomo Chavez, was 29, an elementary school teacher. She was active. She'd been hiking with Ryan on weekends for a while. She was excited about this trip, She'd seen photos of the Narrows online and wanted to see it in person. They were staying in Springdale, the small town right outside the park, on what was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. They arrived the night before and slept in. On the morning of August 17th, they got a late start, which happens every once in a while. You're on vacation, you don't set an alarm, you take your time, right? They reached the Temple of Sinawava trailhead a little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The air temperature at that moment was already 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Between the two of them, they were carrying 2 1-liter water bottles. Total, the standard recommendation for hiking in extreme desert heat is roughly 1 liter per person per hour. They had, at most, enough water to last one person through 1 hour of hiking. They also had a filter straw, one of those backpacker tools, designed to remove biological contaminants from water sources. They were both wearing cotton t-shirts and shorts. Neither of them had brought electrolytes. That's when Ranger Valdez enters the picture. Valdez was working the trailhead that afternoon, which meant watching visitors head into the canyon and keeping an eye out for dangerous setups. Part of the job on a day like that was watching for the kind of gear and timing that tends to end badly. The late starts, the inadequate water, the clothing that's going to work against you in the heat. He noticed Ryan and Lauren almost immediately. He told investigators later that several things stood out to him at once, and that each of them alone would have been concerning, but all of them together made a specific and serious picture. It was past 1 o'clock in the afternoon, dangerously late to be starting a canyon hike in August. The temperature was already at 108 and would stay above 100 for hours. Their water supply was nowhere near adequate for what they were attempting in those conditions, and it was visibly clear to anyone paying attention. Even before they started walking, both of them showed the early signs of dehydration. Dry lips, slightly flushed skin, a particular flatness in their affect that an experienced ranger learns to recognize. Their cotton shirts were going to absorb sweat and hold heat against their bodies rather than wicking it away. Cotton is fine for a lot of things. Hiking in triple-digit desert heat is not one of them. And the filter straw, while a reasonable piece of backpacking gear under normal circumstances, was designed to handle biological contamination bacteria, protozoa, the things that make you sick a day or two after you drink bad water. It was not designed to address the temperature of water that had been sitting in a desert canyon in August, or its chemistry after months of stagnation. Valdez walked over to them and explained the situation in terms he said he tried to make as clear as possible without being condescending. He told them the pools inside the canyon were not cool. He told them there was almost no flowing water on the route. He told them that the sandstone walls, which absorb solar radiation all day long and then radiate that stored heat back outward hours after direct sunlight has passed, could push the experienced temperature inside the canyon significantly above the already brutal air temperature outside it. He told them that other hikers had already turned around that day because of conditions, not because they were weak, but because the conditions were genuinely dangerous. Ryan laughed. A short, good-natured laugh, not mean or dismissive, but the kind of laugh that means, I hear you, and I'm gonna do it anyway. He told Valdez they were only planning to go a few miles. Valdez had heard that before. He hears it constantly from visitors who underestimate the math of desert hiking, the way distance multiplies when your body is fighting heat, the way a few miles in normal conditions becomes something entirely different when the temperature is 108 and your water is already gone. He couldn't legally stop them from going. The trail was open, the decision was theirs, and his role had limits. He took note of their descriptions and their approximate start time, mentally flagging them for later. And he watched them walk toward the trailhead. He said later that he didn't feel good about it at all, that he went back to his duties and kept thinking about the two of them and kept checking the time. What investigators believe happened next is based on the physical evidence and the timeline, and I'll walk through it the way they reconstructed it. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Ryan and Lauren were inside the canyon. The initial experience of the Narrows, even in drought conditions, is stunning. The walls are extraordinary towering sandstone in shades of rust and cream and deep red, sculpted by millions of years of water into shapes that don't look real, like something from a science fiction film set. The narrow band of blue sky visible far above. The way sound changes inside the canyon, muffled and close. It's the kind of place that commands your attention completely, and investigators believe that for the first stretch of the hike, the scenery probably did exactly that. It kept them focused on what they were seeing and experiencing rather than on how their bodies were responding to the heat. That's actually one of the subtle dangers of a place like the Narrows. The environment is so visually compelling that it competes with your body's warning signals for your attention. You're taking photos. You're pointing things out to each other. You're moving through a space that feels almost unreal in its beauty, and the headache building at the back of your skull, and the sweat soaking through your shirt feel like minor inconveniences in comparison to the experience you're having. But the heat was there. It was everywhere. Air movement inside the canyon was minimal to non-existent. The narrow corridor that makes the place so dramatic also eliminates the wind that might otherwise provide some relief. The pale sandstone walls reflected sunlight downward and inward from multiple angles, and the rock faces that had been baking in direct sun since morning were throwing that stored heat back out into the space where two people were walking. Investigators believe that within the first hour of the hike, both Ryan and Lauren were sweating heavily through their cotton shirts, and that they were drinking water considerably faster than they had anticipated when they filled those two 1-liter bottles before leaving the trailhead. By the time they'd been walking for roughly an hour, they had probably already consumed close to half of their total water supply. 2 liters between 2 people, roughly 1 liter gone. They had, at most, another liter left to share, in conditions that called for 2 to 4 liters per person per hour. The river was the next problem. Ryan and Lauren had presumably planned, at least in part, to rely on the Narrows' reputation as a water-based hike to help manage the heat. You see the photos, you know people wade through it, you assume it'll be cooler down there near the water. Under normal conditions, that assumption isn't entirely wrong. Flowing water can provide meaningful evaporative cooling, and shaded canyon sections combined with cold, fast-moving water can genuinely drop the perceived temperature by 10 or 15 degrees. There are sections of the Narrows where, in a normal water year, you're wading through water that's cold enough to take your breath away, and the combination of shade and cold water makes you pull your jacket out of your pack. What they found instead, based on what they told the 2 people they encountered on the trail, was muddy pools, algae-covered rocks. Standing water that, when Lauren stepped into it, felt warm to the touch. Not slightly cool, warm. The drought had turned what was supposed to be a flowing river into a series of isolated, sun-warmed puddles separated by stretches of rock that they had to walk across in the full heat, and any cooling effect those pools might have provided was negligible at best. Stepping into a shallow, warm pool and then stepping back out doesn't do anything meaningful for your core temperature. It barely registers. Investigators believe this was a pivotal moment, the moment the hike shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous, when the couple realized that the thing they'd been counting on to mitigate the heat simply wasn't there. The plan had assumed a resource that didn't exist in the form they needed it, and at that point they were already inside the canyon, already partially dehydrated, and already past the easy decision to turn around. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a 67-year-old man named Michael Henson was making his way back toward the trailhead. Henson was a retired photographer who'd been in the canyon earlier in the day and was heading out as conditions worsened. He passed Ryan and Lauren going the opposite direction. He noticed them clearly enough to describe them in detail later. Both were sweating heavily. Their water bottles, which he could see, already appeared nearly empty. He was concerned enough to stop and say something. He told them the afternoon heat was getting worse and that he'd recommend they turn around. Ryan thanked him and said they were almost at their planned turnaround point. Henson continued toward the trailhead. He said later he thought about them on the walkout. What Henson had no way of knowing was that by 3:45, the situation had already deteriorated significantly beyond what Ryan and Lauren had likely communicated to him. The temperature inside the canyon remained above 100 degrees. Ryan had finished his water bottle completely. Lauren had a few mouthfuls left. Between the two of them, they were nearly out of the only thing that was keeping their bodies functional in that environment. They were now facing a decision that investigators believe probably felt more urgent and more frightening than either of them wanted to admit to each other. Out loud, they were deep inside a desert canyon, almost out of water, and the only water around them was the warm, algae-covered standing pools that Ranger Valdez had specifically warned them about that afternoon. They discussed filtering water from the pools. The accounts from Nguyen later, combined with the physical evidence at the site, led investigators to conclude this was almost certainly the conversation happening around this time. The water smelled bad, the kind of smell that triggers an involuntary response in your body, a deep biological warning. They could see algae floating in it. The instinct to avoid putting something that looks and smells like that into your body is powerful and difficult to override, even when you're thirsty. Investigators believe they held off for a while, trying to preserve the small amount of clean water Lauren still had while they debated what to do. But dehydration in extreme heat moves fast. It compounds itself. The thirstier you are, the harder your body has to work to maintain basic function, which generates more heat, which makes you sweat more, which makes you more dehydrated. At some point, the discomfort of drinking questionable filtered water became less frightening than the alternative of not drinking at all. They used the filter straw. Here's the problem with that, and it's an important one. The filter straw Ryan and Lauren were carrying was designed to remove biological contaminants, bacteria, protozoa, giardia, the organisms that cause gastrointestinal illness in people who drink from backcountry water sources. It was not designed to address water temperature. It was not designed to restore the mineral and electrolyte content that their bodies were hemorrhaging through sweat. And the water that came through that filter, though somewhat safer from a pathogen standpoint, was not cold. It was not refreshing in any meaningful physiological sense. It was warm water in small amounts, filtered through a straw from a stagnant desert pool. That's not hydration in any form that was going to help them in the time they had available. Their bodies were running a deficit that the filter straw simply could not close. By 4:15, the heat problem had fused with another issue specific to drought-conditioned canyon hiking. In normal years, the Narrows offers stretches where you and I can sit in moving water, let the current run over them, and drop their core temperature enough to keep going. The water in most years is fed by snowmelt and springs and can be uncomfortably cold even in summer. 10 minutes sitting in it can reset a body that's been fighting heat for hours. None of that was available on August 17th, 2019. The shallow, warm pools didn't provide meaningful cooling. The exposed rock sections between pools were baking hot underfoot. The canyon walls were throwing heat in every direction. Investigators believe Lauren began sitting down more and more frequently during breaks, and that their pace had slowed considerably. They were burning through energy and fluids faster than they could replace them, and the environment around them offered no way to interrupt that process. A little after 4:30, they encountered the second person who would later speak to investigators. A solo backpacker named Eric Nguyen was exiting the canyon from farther upstream. He'd been doing an overnight trip and was on his way out. He came upon Ryan and Lauren resting beside one of the stagnant pools. Ryan asked him how much farther the canyon went. Nguyen told them they were deeper in than they probably realized. He remembered Lauren specifically. He described her as flushed and unusually quiet. He said Ryan seemed to be doing most of the talking. Nguyen told them they should head back immediately. After he passed them, investigators believe the couple did resume hiking. Whether they were heading deeper in or had begun turning around at that point, Nguyen couldn't say for certain his last view of them was while he was still moving away. But given the timeline of what happened next, it's likely that whatever continued movement they made in the next 45 minutes or so was very slow. By 5 o'clock, Lauren's body was telling her very clearly that something was wrong. Heat exhaustion, which is what she was almost certainly experiencing at this point, based on what searchers found and what treating physicians later documented, doesn't feel like a dramatic collapse. It feels like a headache that gets heavier and heavier. It feels like a wave of dizziness when you stand up too fast. It feels like nausea that makes the idea of eating or drinking anything deeply unappealing at the exact moment when eating and drinking are the only things that could help.
Imagine your body literally trying to shut down non-essential functions to protect your core, and thinking clearly starts to become one of those non-essential functions.
That's the dilemma they were in. Investigators believe Lauren was experiencing all of this: the headache, the dizziness, the nausea. Ryan was fighting his own symptoms. His legs were cramping, which is a sign of severe electrolyte depletion. Both of them were still sweating, which meant their bodies were still fighting, but that sweating was accelerating the dehydration that was making everything worse. Their conversation had dropped off. They were moving from patch of shade to patch of shade, stopping in every one. At some point, around 5:30, they turned around.
I want to pause here and talk about what that realization feels like, because I think it's important for understanding what the next few hours were like for them.
When you're hiking into a canyon and you turn around, there's a moment where it hits you that every mile you walked in is a mile you owe yourself on the way back out. If you walked 2 miles in, you walk 2 miles back. If you walked 3, you walk 3. Ryan and Lauren had gone significantly deeper into the canyon than they probably intended, investigators believe. They were somewhere in the range of 3 miles or more from the trailhead. In normal conditions, for two reasonably fit people, 3 miles is nothing. An hour's walk, maybe less. But they were already in the early stages of heat illness. The canyon walls that had absorbed sunlight all day were still radiating that stored heat even as the light shifted. And every step back toward the trailhead required energy and hydration that they simply didn't have enough of. The return trip was going to take much, much longer than it should have. By 6:15, Lauren was stumbling. The canyon at that hour was nearly empty. Most visitors had finished their hikes and left. The people who remained were moving out, not in, and the couple was now deep enough in and slow enough that they were essentially alone. Investigators believe Ryan was carrying parts of Lauren's gear by this point, trying to reduce the load on her while managing his own deteriorating condition. She needed to stop repeatedly. During one of those stops, she sat down for nearly 20 minutes. Getting up and moving again after stopping when your body is fighting heat, illness is physically and mentally brutal. Every rest stop digs you a little deeper into the hole because you're losing time and your core temperature is not actually recovering the way you think it might be. Their phones were useless. When they tried to use them at around 6:45, there was no service inside the canyon, which is typical for slot canyon terrain. The batteries were also low from taking photos during the earlier, better part of the hike. Neither phone could reach anyone. They were on their own. By 7:15, Lauren's symptoms had crossed a threshold. The line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke is not a dramatic line in the moment. It can be subtle, especially if you're the person experiencing it or the person watching someone you love experience it. From the outside, someone in the early stages of heat stroke can look like someone who is just very, very tired and very, very hot. They're slower, they're confused, they're not tracking conversations the way they normally would. It can be easy to attribute those things to exhaustion rather than to a medical emergency that is actively progressing. But physiologically, what's happening is severe. When your body's core temperature climbs above approximately 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the cooling system begins to fail. Sweating alone can no longer keep up. Blood that should be circulating to organs gets redirected as the body tries to manage its temperature. The brain is particularly vulnerable. It's heat sensitive in ways that other organs aren't, which is why confusion and cognitive impairment are among the earliest signs that heat exhaustion has become heat stroke. Your brain literally starts working less well because it's too hot. Investigators believe Lauren was at or approaching that threshold by 7:15. She was confused, struggling to answer Ryan's questions clearly and promptly. She was having trouble keeping her balance without holding onto the canyon wall or Ryan's arm. Ryan, exhausted himself and struggling to stay upright, was trying to help her move forward while also managing his own failing body. He was still sweating, which meant his body's cooling system hadn't completely failed yet, but he was severely dehydrated and his legs were no longer cooperating the way he needed them to. Their pace had slowed to almost nothing, not miles per hour fractions of a normal walking speed. Whatever distance they had left to cover, it was going to take far longer than they had. Around 7:45, Lauren couldn't go any further. Investigators believe she sat down against a sandstone wall near one of the shallow pools. Ryan stayed with her. He tried to encourage her to stand, to keep moving, to get up repeatedly, based on the physical evidence at the scene. At some point, he sat down as well. Back at the trailhead, Ranger Valdez was watching the trailhead exit area. By 8:30 in the evening, Ryan and Lauren had not come out. Valdez had made a mental note of them hours earlier, their late start, their inadequate water, the way they'd ignored his warning. When he realized they still hadn't returned, he notified search personnel immediately. He remembered their faces and their clothing, which helped searchers know who they were looking for. Teams were organized and entered the canyon before full darkness. The search lasted less than 2 hours. At approximately 10:20 in the evening, searchers found Ryan and Lauren near that sandstone wall. Lauren was unresponsive, suffering from what medical personnel described as severe heat illness. Ryan was conscious, but unable to stand without assistance. Both were evacuated from the canyon. Lauren was transported to a regional hospital in critical condition. Ryan was treated for severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. Hospital records documented dangerously elevated core body temperatures in both patients. They both died. I've covered a few cases on this show, and something I keep coming back to over and over again is how rarely these tragedies are the result of one single catastrophic decision. Usually it's a chain, a series of small, individually understandable choices that combine into something fatal. Ryan and Lauren made several of those choices, starting after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, bringing 2 liters of water between them, wearing cotton in triple-digit heat, going deeper than they planned despite warning signs their bodies were already giving them. Any one of those decisions alone might not have mattered. All of them together, in a canyon that was already as dangerous as it gets, left them no margin for error and no way out. But the decision I keep thinking about is the one that they made at the trailhead after Ranger Valdez explained exactly what was waiting for them. He didn't give them vague cautions. He was specific and direct. The pools aren't cold, the walls radiate heat, hikers turned around today, and Ryan laughed and said they were going a few miles. I don't think he was reckless by nature. I think he was confident in a way that felt completely reasonable to him based on everything he knew about himself. He was fit. He pushed through discomfort. He'd done hikes before. What he didn't account for was that the desert doesn't negotiate with fitness or willpower. It operates on physics and physiology, and on August 17th, 2019, the math was never going to work in their favor no matter how tough either of them was. Ranger Valdez watched them walk into the canyon knowing what he knew, and there was nothing he could legally do to stop them. He said later that watching them go was one of the worst feelings he'd had in years on that job. He was right about everything, and being right about everything didn't save anyone. It was March 14th, 2023 in Scottsdale, Arizona, when the idea of hiking Angel's Landing in Zion National Park first became a fixed plan tied to a specific summer trip. That evening, a screenshot of an Angel's Landing summit photograph was posted. Within hours, it drew multiple reactions, including a question about whether access had already been secured. Vienne Jemison was 51 years old. She lived in northeastern Scottsdale near the edge of a large desert preserve and worked in pharmaceutical sales, a field defined by persistence, composure under rejection, and long-term goal pursuit. She was an active recreational hiker with consistent experience on desert trails in Arizona and occasional trips to higher elevation terrain, reflected in her regular outdoor activity and documented hikes. It never really became a full hiking plan in the environmental sense. It narrowed early into a single objective, getting onto Angel's Landing, permit or not. Everything else, water, heat, turnaround decisions, stayed secondary to that. Access became the defining constraint she organized everything around. In January, February, and March, she entered the permit lottery multiple times and did not secure a date for her planned summer trip. Early responses to the results were restrained frustration, followed by continued attempts and informal advice seeking about better odds or alternative dates. By April, her framing had shifted. The permit system stopped being something she was working within and became something she was working around, reinforced by framing it as administrative rather than safety-driven. The focus shifted away from the hiking conditions behind the restriction and toward removing the restriction itself.
I'm not gonna overthink it, but she didn't get a permit. She didn't even get it after multiple tries, and at some point, you can kind of see the focus start shifting away from the trail itself and more toward finding a way around it.
Her subsequent research shifted toward bypass logistics rather than trail conditions, enforcement timing, checkpoint locations, penalties for unauthorized access, and alternative approaches using the West Rim route from Lava Point. The evaluation framework moved from whether the hike was manageable under conditions to how it could be completed outside the permit system.
What I really don't see here is how uneven the attention is between the system she was trying to get through and the actual conditions she was stepping into.
Even with forecasts pointing to sustained triple-digit heat, that information never carried the same weight as the access problem. It stayed secondary in the planning. By the time she reached Zion, she had a detailed entry strategy, but a much less developed model of what that distance, elevation, and heat would actually combine into on the ground. The logistics were clear, the physical consequences were not fully internalized. She arrived in Springdale on the evening of June 15, a small gateway town positioned just outside the southern entrance to the canyon system and functioning almost entirely as the operational base for visitors entering the park. In peak season, the town operates less like a destination and more like a processing point, a place where hikers, tour groups, and independent travelers converge briefly before dispersing into the canyon at first light. The streets were active with early summer traffic, with gear shops, food stops, and shuttle pickup points moving at a steady but familiar rhythm shaped by seasonal demand. Her accommodation was located near the park entrance within walking distance of the shuttle system that serves the canyon corridor. She checked in without issue and appeared structured and composed in her preparation, treating the evening as part of a planned sequence rather than a point of decision. There was no visible hesitation in her movements or changes in intent. Outside, temperatures remained warm but still within a manageable early summer range for the region, the kind of desert heat that experienced hikers often accept as baseline conditions rather than a limiting factor, especially during evening hours when the canyon temporarily cools before the next day's rise.
There's not much focus, at least from what I could tell, on things like heat illness, how much water she'd realistically need, or when you're supposed to just turn around if it gets too much in exposed canyon terrain.
She spent the evening handling routine preparations, organizing gear, reviewing timing, and orienting herself to the logistics of the following morning. The atmosphere in town reflected the broader season, visitors arriving late, others returning from completed hikes, and early risers preparing for departures before daylight. Nothing about the environment really would have stood out as unusual for someone planning a long summer hike in Zion. Early starts are just what people do out there, and heat management is usually baked into the timing of the day rather than something you avoid altogether. By the following day, official heat warnings had been issued across the park and surrounding canyon system. Forecasts projected temperatures rising above 100 degrees Fahrenheit at canyon level, with advisory guidance recommending that strenuous outdoor activity be avoided during peak daylight hours. The warning was distributed through multiple channels: visitor centers, shuttle stops, trailhead signage, and ranger briefings directed at incoming hikers. It was not framed as an abstract forecast, but as an active condition affecting decision-making on the ground. By that point, it was already influencing behavior, with some visitors shortening itineraries, adjusting start times, or turning back before committing to exposed or high-exertion routes. She acknowledged the advisory, but didn't really change her plan. Later that day, she drove north out of the canyon area toward higher elevation near the park boundary, and you could feel the difference pretty much right away with the change in altitude. It was cooler, less direct heat, just an entirely different feel compared to down in the canyon. Her movement through the area was brief but deliberate. She followed the access road leading toward the West Rim approach, stepped into the trail entry zone, and oriented herself visually along the route system that would eventually connect back into the canyon proper. The purpose of the visit was not exploratory in the traditional sense. She did not appear to be testing her capacity or reassessing difficulty. Instead, her actions suggested confirmation, verifying access points, understanding entry logistics, and visually reinforcing the path she intended to use. After a short period on foot near the trailhead area, she returned to her vehicle and drove back toward town. That evening, she spoke with someone close to her who raised explicit concerns about the forecasted heat and the physical demands of the route under those conditions. The conversation centered on timing and exposure, specifically the risks associated with sustained exertion in triple-digit temperatures and the difficulty of maintaining safe hydration levels over a long-distance canyon. Hike. In response, she described a plan built around a pre-dawn departure, intended to place her deep into the route before the sun fully reached the canyon floor.
Even hearing that conversation about the heat and the water, I feel like the plan was already locked in on timing more than anything else at that point.
She outlined steady forward movement through the hike, with an expectation of returning before peak temperatures fully developed in the late morning and afternoon. She also referenced carrying a limited supply of water and mentioned the possibility of a seasonal water source along the route, though there was no indication of a confirmed filtration method or a backup hydration strategy if that source proved unavailable. The assumption of availability remained unverified, but factored into her overall planning approach. Before ending the conversation, she agreed to send check-ins at key points along the hike, including major transitions along the route where her progress could be tracked. The agreement was framed as a simple precaution rather than a response to risk. After the call, she finalized her departure timing for the following morning, structuring it around a pre-dawn start intended to maximize travel through the canyon before environmental conditions reached their daily peak. She was moving before dawn. The Airbnb host later noted that her vehicle was already gone when he checked the driveway in the early morning hours, earlier than expected based on her stated plan to leave before sunrise. The drive from Springdale to the Lava Point trailhead takes roughly 40 to 50 minutes in light traffic, and she had driven the route before. She arrived at the Lava Point trailhead while it was still dark. Based on the timestamp of a photo she posted from the location, a headlamp-lit image of the trailhead sign framed by dense forest and a fully black sky. The caption read, "No permit needed for this entrance." At that elevation, temperatures were in the upper 50s and 60s Fahrenheit. She was dressed for cool pre-dawn conditions, wearing a long-sleeve base layer, with her hat stored in her pack. The environment was still and quiet, a brief desert interval before daytime heat began to build. She began the West Rim Trail shortly after arriving. The West Rim Trail from Lava Point to the canyon floor covers roughly 13 miles, with about 3,600 feet of net descent. The route alternates between gradual loss of elevation, flat stretches, and short climbs, before dropping more consistently toward the canyon. Under normal conditions, most hikers take around 5 to 8 hours to complete the one-way stretch, depending on pace and how much they're carrying, with the full out and back toward Angel's Landing adding up to roughly 16 to 17 miles. In mild weather, it's tough but doable as a full-day hike. In extreme heat, though, it stops feeling like a regular hike pretty quickly and turns into more of a long, drawn-out exposure situation out there on the trail. The upper section of the trail initially passes through dense forest, before opening into exposed ridgelines as elevation is lost. In the early portion of the hike, conditions were still shaded and cool, with minimal environmental stress beyond distance and navigation. She was moving through terrain that matched the expectations she had built during planning, and her pace remained steady through the first segment. At one point along the descent, she was encountered by two backpackers traveling in the opposite direction after completing their backcountry route. They later described her as moving steadily but at a slower pace than their own. In a brief exchange, she asked about conditions ahead, specifically crowding and water availability further down the trail. They reported that lower sections were becoming busier and that they had not stopped at the seasonal water source at Potato Hollow.
I look at this, and what really stands out to me is how much is being leaned on things that aren't really guaranteed, like assuming that water source will actually be there and actually usable without a real backup plan behind this whole thing.
They recalled her wearing a sun hat and a light long-sleeve layer, with a single water bottle visible on her pack. No additional hydration containers were observed. The interaction was brief, and both parties continued on their respective routes without further contact.
I think the whole check-in and timing thing just feels more like a plan on paper than something adjusting to what the trail was actually going to throw at her.
Based on this encounter and standard segment timing for the trail, she was estimated to be in the mid to lower portion of the West Rim corridor by that point, with several miles still remaining before reaching the junction with the Upper Angels Landing route above Scout Lookout. The remaining terrain from there transitions into progressively steeper descent, with increasing exposure and less shade as the trail approaches the canyon floor. By then, conditions below were already warming rapidly. As sunlight reached deeper into the canyon, temperatures were climbing into the upper 80s and continuing to rise steadily with full solar exposure. At that stage, she had been hiking for several hours and had covered roughly 8 to 9 miles, with the most technically exposed and physically demanding sections of the route still ahead. She posted from Scout Lookout late that morning. The photo showed her at the edge of the lookout platform, the canyon stretching behind and below her under a high, harsh sun. She was smiling. Her hat was on, and her pack sat high on her back, a standard day pack by appearance, with no visible hydration reservoir and nothing suggesting significant water capacity. The focus just kind of shifted away from the landscape itself and more toward the milestone she'd been building up to for months. The distance and conditions were still there, nothing about that changed, but they didn't really seem to land the same way at that moment. In that moment, the dominant perception was completion not of the route itself, but of the objective she had been working toward. The physical reality of the remaining distance, elevation loss, and rising heat remained unchanged, but it was no longer being weighted in decision-making. The Upper Angels Landing section from Scout Lookout to the summit spans roughly half a mile and gains about 430 feet in elevation. Unlike the approach from Lava Point, this is not a conventional hiking trail. The West Rim descent below it is still a maintained path, with defined tread and predictable footing, even if demanding in length and exposure. The chain section, by contrast, is a narrow ridge traverse with fixed chains anchored into sandstone, following an exposed spine with steep drop-offs on both sides. The rock itself is generally solid when dry, but the route requires constant attention and deliberate movement. Every step carries consequences that are not present on standard trail terrain. She moved through this section in the mid-morning window.
Honestly, Scout Lookout has always felt a bit deceptive to me, like people naturally read it as they made it, even though the hard part is still sitting right there in front of them on the return. And the chains section, I don't know, I always thought of it less like a hike at that point and more like something you have to fully respect every single step of, or it just doesn't work.
Her ascent was steady based on available timestamps from her posts. One image captured her partway along the ridge, looking back towards Scout Lookout and the canyon system she had come from. Another showed her at the summit, where the terrain opens into a wide, elevated panorama of southern Zion, with the Virgin River visible below and the canyon floor stretching outward through sandstone formations and tree-lined corridors. The summit post marked the completion of the climb and a brief pause at the top before she began her return. She remained at the top for a short period before beginning her return. During that time, she sent a voice message to a group chat, later described by recipients as sounding energized and slightly winded. She referenced the heat briefly but minimized it, describing conditions as manageable. Her focus was on reaching the summit and the sense of completion that came with it. She did not mention the total distance already covered, her remaining return route, or the state of her water supply. At that point, she was still several miles from the trailhead, with the only route back requiring retracing the exposed chain section she had just crossed, followed by a long descent through the canyon under rapidly intensifying heat. Temperatures at elevation are already in the upper 90s and continuing to rise through the late morning. She had covered roughly 9.5 miles from Lava Point, with sustained elevation change and prolonged exposure on open desert terrain. The descent toward the canyon floor had already removed most of her elevation buffer, leaving her roughly 5,800 feet above sea level, with a final return still requiring a steep climb out of the canyon system after completing the lower sections. Ahead remained the chain section, the switchbacks below Scout Lookout, and the long canyon approach to the trailhead a short distance on a map, but a significant physical effort after hours of continuous movement in rising heat. Under normal conditions, this return is hard but still doable. Here, though, it really wasn't in that normal space anymore. She was already tired, low on water, and moving straight into peak heat where everything just kind of piles on at once: fatigue, dehydration, and heat all feeding into each other. Heat exhaustion at this stage was no longer a discrete event, but the continuation of an accumulating physiological decline, where fatigue, dehydration, and heat exposure reinforced each other and progressively degraded coordination and judgment. There are no definitive witness accounts of her condition during the descent through the chain section. Two hikers moving in the opposite direction later described her as steady and unremarkable, consistent with many solo hikers navigating the same terrain. She was not observed requesting assistance or showing overt distress. She passed below Scout Lookout. Whether she paused there is unknown, and no reliable accounts place her resting despite the high foot traffic. From there, she continued onto the switchback descent toward the canyon floor, still within terrain that required attention, but now under increasing heat stress and accumulated fatigue.
One thing that sticks with me is how the summit can mess with your sense of where you're on the hike, because it feels like the goal is done, it's over with. But the reality is, you still have a long, exposed walk back in worsening heat.
The trail below Scout Lookout descends through a series of switchbacks carved into the canyon wall before eventually meeting the main canyon trail that leads toward the Grotto trailhead. The terrain here is less exposed than the chain section above, but it is not straightforward. The grade remains steep, the footing shifts between packed sand and loose gravel, and the rock walls on both sides hold and re-radiate heat long after direct sun exposure, turning the corridor into a sustained warm zone with limited relief. Shade is minimal, and by late morning canyon, temperatures in this section typically reach the upper 90s and can approach triple digits. Roughly a third of a mile below Scout Lookout, the main trail curves around a rock outcrop. Right there, there's also this worn-down side path basically formed just from people repeatedly walking it over time that splits off from the main trail and leads back to a small overhang tucked just off to the side. The overhang casts intermittent shade on the rock beneath it, creating a visible contrast against the surrounding sunlit sandstone. To a passing hiker, it can resemble a natural pause point, a place to step off briefly, catch breath, or escape direct heat. Whether Vienne Jemison intentionally moved toward that shaded area in search of rest, or whether her navigation had degraded enough under fatigue and heat stress that she followed the worn path without clear intent, is not established. Both interpretations remain consistent with the physical evidence recovered at the scene and the medical findings regarding her condition at the time of the incident. What is established is that she left the main trail at that point and moved onto terrain that was no longer part of any maintained route. The ground transitions quickly from compacted sand to uneven sandstone slabs with a noticeable slope and intermittent drop-offs. These surfaces are not inherently unstable, but they demand precision in foot placement and full attention to balance. Under normal conditions, they require care. Under conditions of fatigue, dehydration, and heat stress, they leave very little room for error. The fall was not witnessed. Her final footprints indicate movement off the main trail and onto the unmaintained section before disappearing near the edge of the ledge system. Below that point, the terrain drops away steeply, with an approximate descent of 180 feet to the next stable shelf of rock. Later that day, her friends in a group chat attempted to reach her after the expected return window passed. Messages went unanswered, followed by repeated calls that went to voicemail. Concern escalated into a formal report when it became clear she had not returned to her lodging and had not exited the trail system.
It always looks easier than it is, but you're still dropping steep switchbacks with heat just sitting in the canyon walls the whole way down. That side path just feels like a quick spot people drift into to get out of the sun for a second.
Her rental vehicle was located at the Lava Point trailhead, establishing her point of entry on the West Rim approach. Combined with the earlier summit post and the absence of any return through the main canyon exit, this allowed rangers to narrow the search corridor to the stretch between Scout Lookout and the canyon floor. Search teams began ground operations from the upper trail. Her body was located later from the main route below the social trail divergence point. Recovery required rope-assisted access due to the steepness of the terrain. She was pronounced deceased at the scene, and recovery continued into the following hours under standard technical rescue procedures. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy 2 days after recovery. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from height, with a contributing factor of heat exhaustion. Findings indicated significant dehydration and prolonged heat stress at the time of death, reflecting a body already under sustained thermal strain that impaired coordination, judgment, and recovery capacity. No underlying cardiac or neurological condition was identified that would account for a sudden collapse independent of environmental exposure. A subsequent incident report by park authorities identified multiple contributing factors, including sustained extreme heat during the hiking period, insufficient hydration for the duration and distance of the route, and an access approach that extended both mileage and exposure compared to the standard route. It noted that bypassing the usual entry system formed part of a sequence of decisions that increased overall exposure and risk, though it was not identified as the direct cause of death. The combination of heat, distance, and fatigue was cited as the primary compounding factor. At her lodging, belongings were found undisturbed and partially packed, consistent with an expected departure. Travel arrangements for the following day remained unchanged. On her device, an unsent draft was recovered, referencing months of preparation and repeated attempts to secure access, ending with a reflection on finding a way forward despite those setbacks. It was July 10th, 2021. And the thermometer outside the visitor center at Furnace Creek had already cleared 117 degrees before lunch. Death Valley was in the middle of the kind of heat wave that makes the national news. The week the official gauge would touch 130, one of the highest temperatures ever reliably recorded anywhere on the planet. To put that in perspective, a normal oven set to keep food warm sits not far above that. The parking lot at the Golden Canyon trailhead shimmered like there was water on it. Most people who pulled in took one step out of their air conditioning, felt the air hit them like an open oven door, and got right back in their cars to go find a viewpoint they could enjoy through a windshield. The radio that morning was full of heat warnings, the kind that tell people to stay indoors, check on elderly neighbors, and never leave anyone sitting in a parked car. And the whole region was bracing for a day that would break records. One of them did not. Her name was Leanna Marchetti, 28 years old, and to thousands of people online, she was a full-time adventure influencer. Her whole brand was being the fearless one, the girl who did the thing everyone else was too scared or too sensible to do, and she had the numbers to prove that people loved watching it. She had built that following over years, one bigger risk at a time, swimming in places with signs that said "do not swim," climbing things that were roped off, walking up to wild animals other people backed away from. The trouble with a brand like that is that it has to keep escalating. An audience that follows you because you are fearless gets bored the moment you start looking careful, and Leanna knew it. Every video had to be a little bolder than the last one, a little closer to a line, and the comments rewarded her every time she leaned further out over the edge. She had come to Death Valley in the worst week of the entire summer on purpose, because heat that made the news made for views, and a video of her conquering the hottest place on Earth in record temperatures was exactly the kind of thing her audience showed up for. She had the whole video planned in her head before she ever left the car. The dramatic walk into the canyon, the harsh light, a piece to camera at the top about pushing past your limits, and a caption about doing the thing everyone swore was impossible. It was going to be one of her best, the kind of post that pulls in a wave of new followers and a flood of comments calling her a legend. In a strange way, the ranger had handed her a gift, because now the video had a villain to wave off at the start, a perfect little setup for the triumph she was certain was waiting at the end. Here's the thing you have to understand about how she saw a place like this. To Leanna, a warning was not a warning, it was a setup for a better video. The scarier something sounded, the better the story when she walked away from it, smiling, unbothered, proven right. She had spent years training her audience to expect exactly that, and she had spent those same years quietly training herself to ignore the part of her brain that was supposed to be afraid. By the time she got to Death Valley, that part of her had been overruled so many times that it had basically stopped speaking up. I've seen her type before, the kind who built a brand on ignoring advice, so to her, a ranger saying no was just more content. Death Valley is not dangerous the way a cliff is dangerous, where you can see the edge and respect it. It kills you quietly, through a number on a thermometer that does not look like it should be able to hurt you. There is no claw, No fall, no single dramatic moment, just heat, steady and patient and absolutely without mercy. That is exactly what makes it so deadly, because a threat you cannot see and cannot feel sneaking up on you is a threat that is very easy to underestimate right up until the point where it is far too late to do anything about it. In heat like that, your body is in a fight from the second you step outside. You sweat out water faster than you could ever drink it back, and because the desert air is so dry, the sweat evaporates off your skin almost the instant it appears, so you often cannot even see that you are drenched and emptying out. The official temperature is always measured in the shade. Out in the open, on dark rock, in direct sun, the real temperature against your body runs far higher than whatever number the sign in the parking lot shows. People walk out into that believing the sign, never understanding that the sign was describing the easiest version of where they were going. By the time most people understand that difference, they are already deep into the canyon, already low on water, and already feeling a little off in a way they cannot quite put a name to. Death Valley kills people every single year, and the ones it kills are almost always the ones who came to look at it rather than to survive it. Tourists step out for a quick photo and go down within sight of the road. Hikers underestimate a short trail and never climb back out of it. The rangers will tell you the same thing over and over, that the desert does not care how fit you are or how many hard things you have done somewhere cooler. Fitness buys you a little extra time out here and absolutely nothing more. What actually keeps you alive is respect, water, and the sense to be shaded and still when the sun is at its worst. I tell people Death Valley in July is not a desert, it's a furnace with a parking lot. The hike she had picked was the Golden Canyon Loop, a route that climbs up through a maze of golden and red rock toward the famous overlook at Zabriskie Point and comes back down through a wash called Gower Gulch. In the cool months, it is one of the most beautiful and popular day hikes in the entire park, busy with families and photographers. In July, it is a different thing wearing the same name. There is no water anywhere on it, none, and there is no shade either, not a single tree, not one reliable overhang, just bare rock that drinks the sun all day and throws it back at you from every direction at once. The Badlands have one more trick to them, and it is the one that turns a heat emergency into a death. They look identical in every direction. The same bleached gold walls, the same dry folds and ridges, narrow side canyons branching off the main route like hallways in a building with no signs and no numbers on the doors. With a clear head and a marked trail, it is a wonderful place to wander. With a cooking brain and no landmarks, it is a trap that closes so softly you do not even hear it shut behind you. Search teams have pulled people out of those exact side canyons before, some of them only a short distance off the main trail, close enough that on a clear-headed day they could have walked back out in minutes.
I've walked those Badlands, and there's no shade out there. Not a tree, not an overhang, just rock throwing heat back at you.
The man standing near the trailhead that morning was a ranger named Cal Renfro. Cal had worked Death Valley for the better part of 30 years, and in that time he had helped carry more than a few people out of these canyons, some of them walking and shaking and lucky, and some of them not walking at all. Summer was the season he hated, because summer was when people came from all over the world to see the famous heat, treating a killer like a tourist attraction, and a certain number of them every single year decided that the warnings were meant for somebody else. He had learned over the decades to read people fast, because reading them fast was sometimes the only thing that saved them. He knew the difference between the hiker who was nervous and prepared and the hiker who was confident and carrying nothing. He knew that the dangerous ones were almost never the ones who looked scared. They were the ones who looked sure of themselves. The ones who had clearly done risky things before and gotten away with it, because getting away with it was exactly what taught them they could not be hurt. Cal spotted Liana the moment she stepped out of her car with a phone already pointed at her own face. Cal spent 30 years pulling people off that trail. When a man like that tells me to turn around, I'm back in my car before he even finishes the sentence. He did what he always did. He walked over, friendly but serious, and told her plainly that she should not attempt the loop today. He told her it was already over 115 degrees and still climbing, that the canyon would be hotter still with no air moving through it, and that people had died on easier hikes than this one, in less heat than this. He pointed at the small bottle clipped to her bag and told her that was not nearly enough water, that a hike like this in this heat needed gallons, not a bottle. He told her that if she truly meant to do it, she had to start at first light the next morning, not late on a day that was already an emergency. None of what Cal said was an opinion, and none of it was him being dramatic. It was the same message printed on the big signs all around the parking lot, the ones with the red letters that exist precisely because so many people have died doing exactly what she was about to do. The park does not send rangers out to warn people at that trailhead in a heat wave for fun. It puts them there because that specific trail, in that specific heat, has a body count, and because a friendly human voice saying "turn around" saves more lives than any sign ever has. Cal had personally turned a lot of people back over the years. Most of them, when it came down to it, listened. Liana did not listen. She turned the camera on him instead. For her followers, she narrated the whole thing as it happened. This overprotective ranger who thought a little walk was going to kill her, who so clearly did not know who he was talking to. She let him finish, thanked him with the kind of smile that was really a dismissal, and told him she would be totally fine. She did stuff like this all the time. Then she clipped her one small bottle back onto her bag, fixed her hair in the camera, and started up the trail into the canyon while he stood there and watched her go. There was nothing he could legally do to stop a grown woman from taking a walk in a national park. She was not the only person Cal spoke to that morning, and she was not the only one who had shown up wanting to hike. The difference was that the others listened. A couple turned around right there in the lot and decided to come back at dawn instead. A young guy who had planned the very same loop took one more look at the heat shimmering off the rock, thanked the ranger, and went to find an air-conditioned diner. None of them got a video out of it, and all of them are still alive. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth about this place, that the people who leave with nothing to post are usually the ones who leave at all. I've watched that clip more than once. She rolls her eyes at Cal while he tells her people die out here. I have thought a lot about what was going through her head as she walked away from that man. I do not think she was being brave, and I do not even think she was being stupid in the way we usually mean it. I think she had simply done this exact thing so many times, ignored so many warnings, and walked away fine that the warnings had stopped carrying any weight at all. Cal was not a 30-year expert to her. He was just one more worried voice to wave off on the way to the shot she wanted. No different from a comment telling her to be careful that she would scroll right past. She started up Golden Canyon a little before 11 in the morning, which is just about the worst possible hour to begin. The early part of the trail was everything she had come for. The walls rose up around her in deep gold and rust red. The light was harsh and dramatic in a way that looks incredible on camera, and the footage she shot in that first half hour was really beautiful. She was moving easily, the trail rising only gently as it wound up into the canyon, narrating as she went, smiling, vindicated. There was no reason in those first minutes for her to feel anything but good about her choice, and that, more than anything, is how the desert gets you. Heading into those canyons at noon never feels dangerous in the moment, and that's the trick of it. I've watched the desert let people walk in. The trail drew her deeper in. She climbed up the side spur toward Red Cathedral, a towering wall of rust-colored rock that is one of the most photographed spots on the whole route, and then pushed on up toward Manly Beacon and the high point of the loop. Down in the lower canyon, the rock walls pressed in close on both sides and trapped the heat like an oven with the door shut. No breeze at all, not a breath of moving air to carry any of it away. Higher up, where the trail climbed out of the canyon and into the open Badlands toward Manly Beacon, the walls fell away and took even the idea of shade with them, leaving her out under a sun that did not let up for a second. She was sweating hard now, though in that dryness she still could not see it, and she was reaching for her one bottle far more often than she had planned to. What made the first part feel so easy was also exactly what made it so dangerous, and she had no way to feel that yet. The trail climbs the whole way in, gaining hundreds of feet up through the wash and out into the open Badlands toward the high ground around Manly Beacon, and the hardest, most exposed stretch of the loop was still ahead of her. Every comfortable step in the cool of the morning carried her deeper into the maze and farther from the only safety there was, her car back at the trailhead. She felt strong and capable and completely right. The desert was simply waiting for the heat of the afternoon to hand her the bill. The first part of that trail feels easy, a gentle walk up a pretty canyon. I promise you that's just the desert letting you get far from your car. By the time she reached the upper section, somewhere in the early afternoon, the temperature down in that open canyon was well past anything the visitor center sign had shown that morning. This is the part of these stories that people who have never stood in it cannot quite picture. It was not uncomfortable the way a hot day at home is uncomfortable. It was a physical force, a steady pressure leaning on her from every direction, the air itself too hot to take any heat away from her no matter how hard or fast she breathed. Her pace fell off. The filming, the entire reason she had driven out here, slowed and then mostly stopped because the heat had begun to demand everything she had just to keep putting one foot in front of the other. By the middle of the afternoon, the canyon had become something close to a kiln. The walls threw heat at her face and her back at the same time, the ground cooked up through the soles of her shoes, and the air gave her nothing to work with no matter how deeply she breathed. She had stopped filming a while ago. The bright, chatty narration of the morning was gone, replaced by the simple animal work of moving forward through air that felt like it was trying to hold her in place. She was deep into the loop now, too far along for turning back to feel obvious, and nowhere near close enough to the end for finishing to be safe. There is a cruel arithmetic to a loop trail in heat like that, where the safest choice and the fastest choice stop being the same thing, and a tired brain almost always grabs for fast. Somewhere on that upper stretch, her water ran out. The small bottle that Cal had pointed at and warned her about, the one she had clipped back on with a smile, was empty hours before she could possibly be back at her car, and there was not one more drop anywhere on that trail. From that moment, she was on a clock that could not be stopped or reset. She was losing water with every breath and every step, in temperatures that would not begin to drop until long after dark, with the hardest climbing of the loop and the long descent through Gower Gulch still standing between her and the parking lot. She carried one little designer water bottle on a hike that needed a gallon. In that heat, that bottle is not water, it's a timer. The first real trouble was almost certainly a headache and a creeping dizziness, the kind of thing that is easy to argue yourself out of for a little while when you are determined to finish. But in heat like that, the body does not give you long to negotiate. As she kept moving, her core temperature was climbing past the point a human being can survive, and the warning signs were stacking up one on top of another. The pounding head, the wave of nausea, the strange and sudden heaviness in her legs that no amount of willpower could lift. At some point, and this is one of the most dangerous moments of all, her skin would have stopped feeling sweaty and started feeling hot and dry. That is the signal that the body's entire cooling system has failed, that it has run out of water to sweat with and simply given up trying. From there, the internal temperature rises fast, and the organ that suffers first and worst is the brain. The very tool she needed most to save herself, clear and careful thinking, was the first thing the heat reached in and switched off. Heat stroke doesn't feel like just being hot. Your judgment is the first thing to go, so the moment you need to think clearly, your own brain stops helping you. And this is where the desert does its cruelest work, because once the thinking goes, everything else follows. A clear-headed person in trouble turns around and retraces their steps straight back to the trailhead they know. Liana, by every later reconstruction of what happened, did the opposite of that. Somewhere up in the maze of the upper Badlands, she left the main trail entirely, turning off into a narrow side canyon. Whether she was chasing one last shot, or convinced it was a shortcut, or simply no longer able to tell the difference. The marked loop was hard enough in that heat. Off the trail, in that terrain, she had just walked into the one place nobody searching would think to look first. Investigators believe she did try to keep going for a long while, the way determined people do, pushing through signals that should have stopped her cold. But heat does not respect determination. The very grit that had built her whole career, the refusal to quit, the certainty that she could power through anything, was now working directly against her, driving her forward and burning through her last reserves when the one thing that might have saved her was to stop, find whatever sliver of shelter existed, and wait for the cool of night. Her greatest strength had quietly turned into the thing walking her toward the edge. Those canyons all look the same inside, like a maze cut from an oven. You don't feel lost in there until you already are. The side canyons of the Badlands are a trap built for exactly this situation. They branch and fork and double back on themselves, every wall the same washed out gold as the last, and they swallow sound and phone signal alike. The phone she trusted for absolutely everything would have been useless to her by now. No service down in the rock, and a battery cooking past the point it would even turn on. She had no paper map, no compass, no extra water, and no clear idea anymore of which direction would take her back. She was wandering, slower and slower, through a place that offered her the same blank answer every way she turned. Time worked against her now, in a way she could not feel. Every minute she spent lost was a minute of water she did not have, in heat that was still climbing toward its afternoon peak. She had told no one her exact plan beyond the ranger she had laughed at. No friend was waiting at the bottom with a worried eye on the time, no partner was tracking her location on a phone, no one in the world who loved her knew precisely where she was or when she was supposed to be back. She had traded all of that away long ago for the freedom to do whatever she wanted, and out here that freedom had nothing left to give her. What followed was slow and disoriented, and from the outside, almost quiet. She moved through the side canyons with no real direction, the walls all the same, the sun straight overhead and then sliding west, every turn looking like a way out and ending in more rock. She had no shade to rest in and no water to wait on. The smart move, if any move was still smart by then, was to stop and conserve. But a confused, overheating brain rarely makes the smart move, and hers was already past making much of any decision at all. Even if she had somehow been able to call for help, the rescue most people quietly assume is always waiting was not a sure thing on a day like that one. Helicopters do not fly the same in extreme heat, because the thin, superheated air gives the rotor blades far less to grab onto, and operations in the worst of the afternoon get much harder and sometimes get grounded entirely. The people who could have come for her, with no idea she was in trouble, no idea she had left the route hours ago, and no way to reach the fold of Badlands she had wandered into even if somehow they had known to try. Everybody out there is quietly counting on a helicopter. In that heat, the air gets too thin for the rotors to lift, and that's a bet I would never make. Heat stroke, once it truly takes hold, moves through the body in stages, and not one of them can be willed away by wanting it badly enough. The confusion deepens into something close to drunkenness. Coordination goes so that walking a straight line becomes impossible. As the core temperature keeps climbing, the organs begin to fail in sequence, and the overheating brain shuts down its higher functions one by one, the way a building powers down floor by floor. A person that far gone stops being able to make a plan, then stops being able to stand, and finally stops being able to do anything at all but sit down where they are. There is a moment where your legs simply stop listening. You are awake, you are scared, and your body has already decided it is finished. Eventually, her body did the deciding for her. The walking slowed to a stagger, the stagger to a few steps at a time, and then to nothing. Somewhere up that dead-end wash, she sat down in the only patch of ground she could reach, and she did not get up again. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing like the movies, just a strong young woman quietly running out of everything a person needs to stay alive in a place that had been trying to tell her exactly that since the moment she stepped out of her car. The desert did not cool off anywhere near fast enough to save her. Even after the sun finally dropped behind the ridgelines, the rock held the day's heat for hours and kept breathing it back out into the dark, and by then, the damage inside her was long past undoing. She was off any trail, a searcher would walk in the dark, tucked up a sidewash in the Badlands with a dead phone and an empty bottle, in a silence so total that most people will never experience anything like it in their lives. All those followers, all that constant noise that had filled every single day of her adult life, and there was not another person anywhere near her in that black stretch of desert. Thousands of people watched her that week, and she died with not one of them within 50 miles of her. The desert never once cared how many followers she had. Liana Marchetti died that night in a side canyon of the Golden Canyon Badlands, of hyperthermia, her body finally overwhelmed by a heat it was never built to withstand, only a handful of hours after she had smiled into her own camera and waved off the one man who tried to save her life. She had come to the hottest place on Earth to prove that she could beat it, in the worst week anyone had ever picked to try, and the desert did to her exactly what the ranger had said it would, on very nearly the timeline he had laid out. She was never going to win that fight. She had walked away from her one real chance of surviving it. The moment she walked away from him, her rental car sat alone in the Golden Canyon lot through the evening and deep into the night. She had come to the park by herself, with no one expecting her anywhere, so there was no worried phone call to start things sooner, just that one car that never left. In a heat wave like that, rangers keep an eye on the popular trailheads, and when the car was still there long after dark, the Park Service knew someone had gone in and not come out. At first light the next morning, they began to look. It still took them well into the morning to find her, off the marked loop, up a dead-end sidewash she never should have entered. The Inyo County coroner ruled the cause of death as hyperthermia, heat stroke, the very thing the signs in that parking lot warn about in big red letters, the very thing Cal Renfro had stood there and told her to her face. On the phone recovered with her body, investigators found all of it, the gorgeous Golden Canyon, the bright, confident narration, and near the very beginning, the clip of a park ranger calmly trying to talk her out of the exact hike that ended up killing her. She had filmed her own warning, she had filmed herself laughing it off. And the thousands of people who had spent years cheering her on for being fearless were left to sit with what Fearless had finally cost. Cal told her face to face how this would end, and she filmed it for laughs. He drove home that night safely. Meanwhile, she lost her life in one of the most brutal ways possible. The 17th of July, 2018, South Kaibab Trail, Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona, 5:47 in the morning. The parking lot at the trailhead was already packed. It was a Tuesday, but it didn't matter. The Grand Canyon draws 4 to 5 million visitors a year, and in mid-July, early morning was the only time the air felt remotely tolerable. Families were taking photos against the railing. A dad was yelling at his kids to stop leaning over the edge. A couple was sharing a granola bar and looking out at a view so big it almost doesn't process right in your brain. A park ranger made his rounds along the rim, stopping every few minutes to speak to groups gathering near the trailhead. His delivery was practiced, but not robotic. You could tell he'd said it 1,000 times and still meant every single one. He told people the canyon was unforgiving in summer heat. He told them dehydration and heat stroke could set in faster than they expected. He told them the trail down to the Colorado River was nearly 7 miles one way and dropped almost 5,000 feet in elevation. Then he said the line that I've heard rangers say at this canyon more times than any other: going down is optional, coming back up is mandatory. Most people nodded politely and kept moving. A few took photos of the warning signs near the trailhead, the ones with bold red text about summer fatalities, not because the signs alarmed them, but because they thought it was funny, a morbid little souvenir. Somewhere in that crowd was a 21-year-old from Texas named Brandon Kowalski. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of build that made strangers assume he played college sports because he did. He was a starting linebacker. He laughed when he heard the Rangers' warning. To Brandon, the canyon looked manageable. The first section of trail from the rim was visible, and the switchbacks didn't look that steep. The morning was still cool. His body was a machine he had been maintaining and testing for years. He had no reason to believe any of this applied to him. Now, I think that to understand what happened on that trail, you have to understand who Brandon was. Brandon was a standout college football player from Texas who built his identity around his athleticism and discipline. Years of praise from coaches, teammates, and others convinced him that he was physically exceptional and could handle challenges that stopped ordinary people. However, his experience was limited to sports training and controlled environments, leaving him unaware that football conditioning does not prepare someone for the dangers of extreme desert hiking. He planned a pre-senior year road trip with his roommate Jabari Warren and Jabari's cautious girlfriend Lucy Miura. They had already been through Las Vegas and stopped at Hoover Dam, which Brandon had found underwhelming. That should have registered in hindsight prior to that Tuesday's hike, but he wasn't thinking. The Grand Canyon was on the itinerary as a half-day stop, take some photos from the rim, maybe walk partway down one of the trails, then drive on to their next destination. That plan lasted until Brandon saw hikers coming back up the trail with dust on their boots and empty water bottles in hand. Someone near them mentioned, almost casually, that if you kept going down far enough, you'd reach the Colorado River itself. Believe me or not, that was all it took. Brandon immediately decided to hike to the Colorado River after hearing how difficult it was, viewing it as a challenge to prove his toughness rather than a carefully planned goal. Jabari and Lucy recognized this familiar pattern of overconfidence. The South Kaibab Trail is one of the Grand Canyon's most demanding routes. With nearly 14 miles round trip, about 4,780 feet of elevation change, no water sources, and little shade. Summer temperatures can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit at the canyon floor, far hotter than conditions at the rim. Despite prominent warnings at the trailhead explaining heat stroke, heat-related deaths, and advising against a rim-to-river and back hike in summer, Brandon dismissed the risks. Below that was a line that I keep coming back to. It noted that athletes and physically fit individuals were particularly vulnerable because their confidence often led them to push past early warning signs that their bodies were sending. Brandon took a photo beside that sign. Based on what Jabari and Lucy told investigators afterward, he made a comment to the effect that whoever wrote it wasn't thinking about someone like him. A ranger who overheard the exchange stopped and spoke to the group. He didn't lecture. He just asked where they were planning to go, and, when Brandon said the river, laid out the problem plainly. The canyon floor would be over 110 degrees by mid-morning. They were starting too late in the day for a safe round trip, and the water they were carrying, a few standard bottles each, was nowhere near enough for 14 miles of desert hiking in July heat. Brandon thanked him politely, but the look on his face, according to Lucy, was not gratitude. It was the look he got when someone told him he couldn't do something. She said later that she recognized it immediately and felt her stomach drop. Lucy told him she thought the ranger was right. She said the trail looked really long from the rim and she wasn't sure she was up for it. Jabari agreed and said they should at least think about it. Brandon told them they were overthinking it. He said the ranger was just doing his job and giving the standard speech. He said they'd be fine. Each warning he received that morning had the same effect. It made him more certain he was going. By the time they actually stepped onto the trail, his decision had nothing to do with wanting to see the river anymore.
I think it's plausible that it had become about proving something to Lucy, to Jabari, and most of all, to himself.
They started down the South Kaibab shortly after sunrise, somewhere around 6:15 in the morning. The first thing that hits you on this trail is the color. The canyon walls are layered in bands of red and orange and cream and deep rust, and in early morning light, they almost look like they're lit from inside. The air was still cool enough that Brandon would have felt good, loose, energized, the kind of feeling that comes before the body starts its real work. The South Kaibab drops fast. It doesn't ease you in. Within the first half mile, the switchbacks begin cutting back and forth across the canyon face, and the trail drops sharply enough that you feel it in your quads almost immediately on the way down. Most hikers pace themselves here instinctively. Brandon did not. Jabari said later that Brandon was out in front within minutes. Not jogging, but walking with the kind of deliberate pace that made it obvious he was measuring himself against everyone else on the trail. And there was plenty of competition to measure against. On a busy summer morning on the South Kaibab, the trail is genuinely crowded. Day hikers carrying camera bags, families with kids and hydration packs, trail runners moving in both directions, backpackers with permits and 60-pound loads headed down to camp. The park also runs mule trains along this trail, and you hear them before you see them, the soft thudding of hooves on packed dirt and the occasional snort echoing off the rock. Brandon passed all of them. Older hikers, younger hikers, people in better gear, people with trekking poles. He moved past every one of them, and according to Lucy, each pass seemed to add something to his mood, a kind of visible satisfaction.
I think it was probably like he was collecting data that confirmed what he already believed.
The views kept opening up the further down they went. Looking up, the rim gets smaller and more distant. Looking out, you can see layer after layer of canyon walls stretching in every direction, and the scale of it does something to your sense of time. You start to feel very small and very old simultaneously, which is either humbling or uncomfortable depending on who you are. By the time they reached Cedar Ridge, which sits roughly a mile and a half down the trail, Lucy had slowed considerably. She was already warm, and she was the only one who had been drinking water consistently. She said her feet were starting to ache from the downhill grade. Jabari was sweating heavily and had gone quieter than usual. Brandon had barely broken a sweat, and he made a point of mentioning it. He interpreted what he was seeing in Jabari and Lucy as evidence that the warnings from the morning had been exaggerated, aimed at people like his friends, not people like him. A group of hikers coming upward past them near Cedar Ridge, and their faces showed the kind of exhaustion that goes past tired into something more serious. Brandon watched them and, by Lucy's account, made a comment under his breath about how some people just weren't in shape for this.
He wasn't being cruel, he genuinely believed it, and I think that was the biggest problem of them all.
They kept going. The trail continued downward past Skeleton Point, which sits at about 5,160 feet and offers the first clear view of the Colorado River far below. Most day hikers turn around here. The recommendation from the Park Service is firm about this Skeleton Point is the turnaround for summer day hikers, no exceptions. A sign says so in plain language. Brandon looked at the river, looked at the sign, and kept walking. They reached the river at the bottom of the canyon sometime around 10 inches the morning. The temperature at the canyon floor by that point was somewhere in the neighborhood of 110 degrees Fahrenheit, possibly higher in the direct sun along the exposed rock near the water. The Colorado River itself runs cold, fed by snowmelt, and released from deep in Lake Powell, and the contrast with the ambient air is shocking when you first get close to it. The water looked green and fast, and the canyon walls rose up on both sides so steeply it felt like standing at the bottom of a crack in the earth. Brandon felt fine. He was sweating, but he said that his energy felt intact.
I'm not sure if that was true, but he took that as confirmation for himself.
What he likely didn't know, and what matters enormously here, is that heat illness doesn't always announce itself immediately. The body can maintain relatively normal function for a period, while heat stress accumulates underneath. Feeling okay at the bottom of the canyon after a 4.5-hour descent in July heat doesn't mean your body is handling the situation well. It may mean the damage is building quietly, below the level of perception. They rested near the river. Other hikers were there too, experienced backpackers with permits who had camped overnight and were preparing to head back out. Several of them, noticing that the three of them had nothing but basic water supplies and no overnight gear, told them directly to head back up immediately. One backpacker, based on what Jabari later told rangers, was emphatic. He said something to the effect that the canyon doesn't care how strong you are, it runs on its own terms. And those terms include physics and chemistry that no amount of fitness can override. Brandon didn't argue. He just smiled and took photos. He shot video of the river. He took photos of himself standing at the bank, grinning, squinting against the light. Based on what investigators later recovered from his phone, he had drafted messages to teammates back in Texas describing the hike as not that hard, saying the warnings had been overblown. There was no cell service at the canyon floor, so the messages sat unsent in his outbox. He never got to a place where he could send them. The three of them should have turned around the moment they arrived. Every piece of guidance from the Park Service printed, posted, and spoken aloud by rangers that morning said as much. Instead, they rested for somewhere close to an hour. Lucy said later that she tried twice to get Brandon moving, and both times he told her there was no rush. That hour mattered. In the heat of a July canyon floor, an extra hour of sun exposure and elevated body temperature is not a minor thing. The physics of heat illness are cumulative. Every additional minute spent at the bottom in that heat was a minute the body spent depleting its ability to regulate itself on the way back up. By the time they started the ascent, it was approaching noon.
I've never been to that area of the Grand Canyon, but I'm relatively familiar with it.
The first thing you notice when you start climbing out is that nothing about it resembles the way down. Going down, your legs are doing work, but it's breaking work, eccentric contractions, the kind that leave your quads sore 2 days later but don't necessarily feel brutal in the moment. Going up is a completely different demand. It is continuous, grinding, forward-leaning effort against gravity, sustained over thousands of feet of elevation gain in heat that intensifies the further you get from the river without the canyon walls offering shade. Lucy felt it almost immediately. Within the first mile of the climb, she told Jabari and Brandon that she wasn't confident she could make it to the rim. Not because she lacked effort she was pushing, but because her body was sending signals that felt different from ordinary fatigue. She was dizzy, her heart rate felt too high. She said the heat felt like pressure rather than temperature, like something sitting on top of her. Jabari was struggling too. He said the ascent was nothing like the descent and that he thought they needed a different plan. He knew about Phantom Ranch, a small lodge and ranger station at the canyon floor about a mile from where they were, and he suggested they head there, explain the situation to rangers, and arrange an alternative exit rather than trying to force the climb in the middle of the day.
And surprise, surprise, Brandon rejected the idea immediately.
He told them they had made it down without any real trouble, and that going up couldn't be that different. He said they were psyching themselves out. Jabari pushed back, said the climb genuinely felt harder, and Brandon's response, according to both Jabari and Lucy, was to call them wimps. He said something close to, "You guys quit way too easily." Lucy told him she was serious.
I think it's obvious she wasn't being dramatic. She was telling him what her body was actually doing, and Brandon dismissed her.
A group of nearby hikers overheard the exchange. One of them, an older man with a full backpacking setup and the kind of tan that comes from a lot of time outdoors, pulled Brandon aside and told him plainly that continuing alone during the hottest part of the day was dangerous, that the canyon claimed people every summer who thought the same thing he was thinking, and that there was no shame in using Phantom Ranch. Brandon thanked him and turned away. Jabari told Brandon one more time to stay with them and go to Phantom Ranch. Brandon told him he'd be at the rim hours before them, that they were making a bigger deal out of this than it was, and that he'd see them when they figured it out. Then he started climbing. The other hikers watched him go. Jabari and Lucy stood there for a moment and then turned back toward Phantom Ranch. That was the last time either of them saw Brandon conscious. Alone on the trail now, Brandon lost the only people who might have slowed him down. In the beginning, he probably felt something close to vindication. He was moving, he was ahead, and the story he would tell back at school was already writing itself in his head, the version where his friends underestimated themselves, and he proved the point by finishing alone. He passed other hikers heading upward. He was still moving at a pace that would have impressed most people on that trail.
But the heat was doing what it does. You have to understand that the South Kebab above the river is almost entirely exposed.
There are a few small overhangs and rock formations, but nothing that qualifies as shade for more than a few minutes. The trail surface absorbs heat and radiates it back upward. The air temperature in the direct sun is higher than the ambient temperature. Every step up is a step closer to the rim, but also a step further into accumulated heat stress that had been building since Brandon first stepped onto the trail 6 hours earlier. His water supply, which had already been insufficient for the conditions, started disappearing faster. When you are working hard in extreme heat, your body needs far more water than most people expect, not just to replace sweat, but to support the physiological processes that keep your core temperature from climbing into dangerous territory. Brandon was a large, muscular person. Large, muscular people require more water, not less. His body was working hard to cool itself, and it was running out of resources to do it with. His pace slowed, then slowed again. He started taking breaks that stretched longer than he probably intended, sitting on rocks in whatever patch of partial shadow he could find. The first physical symptoms of heat illness would have arrived somewhere in here, and this is consistent with what witnesses on the trail observed and later reported to investigators. A headache that doesn't respond to rest, a low, rolling nausea, dizziness that comes and goes, muscle cramps in the legs that make each step harder than it should be. When other ascending hikers stopped to ask if he was okay, and mind you, several did, Brandon told them that he was fine, just tired, and that he's almost there. The trail to the rim was still several miles above him when he was saying this. Needless to say, his pride had become its own trap. Turning around, which was no longer a realistic option anyway, would have meant admitting that Jabari and Lucy had been right, that the ranger had been right, that the sign had been right, that everything he had spent the morning dismissing as noise meant for other people had actually been meant for him. His brain, trained by years of athletic culture to interpret stopping as weakness, wouldn't let him sit with that even as the organ doing the interpreting was beginning to cook inside his skull. Heat stroke doesn't begin the moment you collapse. It is a process. The core temperature rises, the body's cooling mechanisms begin failing. The brain, which is exquisitely sensitive to heat, starts malfunctioning in ways that are invisible from the inside, meaning the person experiencing it often cannot perceive that their thinking has become impaired. Judgment degrades before the person realizes their judgment is degrading. It is one of the most dangerous features of the condition. Brandon kept climbing. By mid-afternoon, Brandon was somewhere between Skeleton Point and the rim, several miles above the river and still several miles from safety. He had been on the trail for nearly 10 hours. The canyon was at its hottest. His body had been accumulating heat stress since before noon. Witnesses later told rangers they had noticed a tall young man moving erratically along the trail. His gait was unsteady. He was veering slightly on the switchbacks rather than tracking the center of the path. He sat down several times in places that offered no shade, which suggested he was stopping not by choice, but by necessity. One group of hikers described stopping to ask him if he needed help. He became irritated and told them he didn't. His words were slow in coming, and the sequence of them was slightly off, not obviously wrong, but enough that one member of the group said later it felt like talking to someone who had just been woken up. They kept watching him from a distance. A few minutes after they spoke to him, he came around a switchback and stumbled. He caught himself on the rock wall beside the trail. Then he stumbled again. The group moved back toward him. This time, his skin was visibly wrong, extremely hot to the touch, and dry rather than wet, which is a sign that the body's sweat response has begun to fail. That failure is one of the markers of full heat stroke rather than heat exhaustion. His responses to questions were confused and delayed. He didn't seem to know what time it was or how far he had come. One member of the group activated emergency services using a satellite communicator. However, Brandon did not sit down. He kept moving upward one slow step at a time for another short distance. I guess it's safe to say that the same drive that had pushed him past every warning that morning had, in the end, been the mechanism of his destruction. His confidence had kept him moving when his body was begging him to stop, and by the time his body won the argument, it was already losing the fight. Rangers were dispatched quickly after the emergency call came in, but the Grand Canyon does not cooperate with urgency. Helicopter evacuation from within the canyon in mid-afternoon in July is complicated by a combination of factors. The intense heat reduces air density, which affects lift capacity, the terrain is narrow and irregular, and wind conditions in the inner canyon can be unpredictable in ways that don't always show up on instruments at the rim. The options for a fast aerial extraction were limited. Ground personnel reached Brandon on the trail. When medical responders took his core temperature, it was critically elevated well into the range where organ damage becomes a near certainty without immediate aggressive intervention. They began cooling him on the trail using whatever resources they had: ice packs, wet cloth, shade from bodies and gear positioned to block the sun. Every minute of core temperature above a threshold damages tissue, including brain tissue. The body's systems, kidneys, liver, heart, brain, begin failing in sequence once heat stroke is established and the cooling response has broken down. He was unconscious by the time evacuation was completed. Rangers and medical personnel worked him the entire way out. His body was young and strong, and it fought the way a good engine will run on fumes longer than a weaker one. But the damage by that point was not something fitness could reverse. Brandon Kowalski died later that evening at a regional hospital. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as exertional heat stroke with severe dehydration and multi-organ failure as contributing conditions.
Mind you, he was only 21 years old.
Jabari and Lucy had reached Phantom Ranch, received assistance from rangers, and hiked out the following morning via the Bright Angel Trail, the longer but more sheltered route to the rim, with water stations along the way. Lucy told investigators she had replayed the conversation at the trailhead 100 times in the days after, trying to find the sentence that would have changed it. Rangers gently told her there probably wasn't one, not because the situation was inevitable. It was because the specific combination of factors Brandon brought to that trail made him nearly impossible to reach by the time the warning started.
The Rangers who worked the case noted something that has stayed with me.
They said Brandon was one of the most physically capable people they had ever seen on a heat fatality report. His resting health, his conditioning, his cardiovascular baseline, all of it was exceptional. The problem was never his body. The problem was that he had spent years building an identity around what his body could do, and that identity had no room in it for the idea that some forces simply do not care about your fitness level. The canyon is not impressed by your deadlift, it is not watching your film, it runs on temperature and elevation and physics, and it applies those things equally to everyone who walks into it.
The kicker, Brandon never got the chance to understand that. He died still believing that he was fine.
It was July 14, 2018, in Furnace Creek, Death Valley National Park, under an active excessive heat warning with extreme triple-digit temperatures. A silver-gray 2014 Honda Civic arrived at a visitor parking area despite the dangerous conditions. The two young women who got out of the car were really just focused on making content like that was basically the whole mindset at that moment. Kayla Renee Durst, 22, was from the Phoenix area. She grew up around extreme heat and kind of assumed that meant she could handle it better than most people. She didn't finish community college and was working part-time at a beauty counter in Tempe while also trying to grow her TikTok, which was mostly centered on desert aesthetics and lifestyle content. By mid-2018, she had a small but growing audience and a pretty clear direction for what she wanted to post more about visuals and trends than anything outdoors related. Her focus was really on content creation, not hiking or anything technical. She had been to a few popular spots in Arizona and the Grand Canyon, but only the easy paved viewpoints. She didn't really have backcountry experience, and she wasn't carrying proper hiking gear either, just basic stuff like lightweight athletic sandals that weren't made for rough desert terrain. Brianna Solano, 21, was her roommate and someone she often worked with on content. She had tried nursing school for a bit, but left before finishing. Compared to Kayla, she was a bit more cautious, but she usually just went along with whatever plans Kayla came up with when it came to trips or shoots. Her social media wasn't as big, and most of their content together ended up being posted through Kayla's account or shared collaborations. The trip to Death Valley was Kayla's idea. It came out of the growing attention around desert travel content online at the time. She had looked up locations and inspiration beforehand, mostly focusing on places that would look good on camera and fit current TikTok trends. At the end of the day, the trip was really about getting striking visuals in a place that was starting to get popular online, not about hiking experience or understanding the risks involved.
I don't really see this as some dramatic thing, like they ignored everything in the moment. It feels more like they were just locked into one goal and didn't really pause to question if the place actually fit what they were trying to do. And honestly, I've seen that pattern before. Once everything starts through the camera, the environment stops being the main focus and just becomes the backdrop.
In midsummer Death Valley, the valley floor sits in conditions where heat stops feeling like weather and starts acting like constant load. The basin's geography amplifies the effect. Mountain ranges trap heat, elevations sit below sea level, and the exposed desert surface offers no meaningful shade or cooling relief. A visitor center in Furnace Creek displays live temperatures and safety advisories, and rangers regularly warn visitors about outdoor exposure in peak summer. Those warnings were there, but they weren't really processed at the moment. What made the conditions easier to underestimate wasn't really a lack of information, it was more how people processed it in the moment. Death Valley actually has pretty clear warnings, but they're the kind you see on signs, boards, or advisories that just stay the same no matter what you're doing. So for visitors who are basically treating the place like a quick stop for photos rather than something physically demanding, those warnings tend to fade into the background.
And from my perspective, that's really where the misread happens. You see the signs, you hear the advisories, but they don't quite land as urgent or personal at the moment.
It ends up feeling like general information sitting there in the background, not something that's actively registering as personal or immediate. The gap between dangerous conditions exists, and this activity is unsafe right now is where misjudgment typically forms, especially when the planned activity is framed as a short, accessible walk rather than sustained exposure. Instead, shortly after arriving, they documented the environment on their phones, treating the extreme heat and temperature displays as part of the visual experience rather than a safety concern. They also retrieved a paper park map from a public display rack and used it to select a nearby geological feature as their destination. The selection process itself did not involve a reassessment of environmental conditions. The trail choice was based on proximity and visual interest rather than seasonal suitability or heat load. On park maps, short-distance trails in Death Valley can appear comparable to casual walking routes elsewhere, with little visual distinction between a mild-season hike and a midsummer exposure route. Without direct consultation with rangers or updated field guidance, the decision remained anchored in distance and aesthetics rather than thermal risk, reinforcing the assumption that the hike would be brief and manageable. The route they picked was shown on the map as a short, easy hike, nothing that really stood out as risky. There wasn't much mention of how different it gets in summer or how serious the heat can be. With the car's air conditioning still running, they left the parking area and just drove south along the main park road toward the trailhead, heading deeper into the valley as the temperature outside was already climbing to dangerous levels. Badwater Road runs south along the floor of Death Valley between two mountain ranges, through a landscape that is exposed, reflective, and intensely heat-retaining in midsummer. The paved road remains accessible to visitors, but the surrounding desert offers little to no relief from direct solar exposure or radiating ground heat. They traveled south with the air conditioning running and arrived at a small gravel trailhead parking area marked for a short canyon hike. One other vehicle was present, but the lot was otherwise empty. The trail begins directly from the pullout and leads into a shallow canyon with a compacted gravel surface and scattered rock. There is no meaningful shade at the start, and canyon walls remain low for some distance before offering any real cover. In mid-morning summer conditions, the air temperature was already well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with ground surfaces significantly hotter in exposed sections. They got out of the car and pretty much started filming right away, short walking clips, wide shots of the canyon, that kind of thing. And honestly, the phones sort of ended up running the whole pace of the hike. They decided when to stop, when to start moving again, and even how they moved through each section of the trail based on what would look good on camera. They had a small shared bottle of water, about a liter total, and early on they just kind of passed it back and forth like it was enough for a quick walk.
I'm gonna be honest here, that already says a lot about how the situation was framed in their minds. More like a short content stop than something physically demanding.
There wasn't much extra gear in the car either. What they had on them was basically it. They were dressed for warm weather, not for desert conditions. So light clothing, minimal footwear, and not much protection from the ground heating up underneath them. A portable charger was left behind in the vehicle, which again shows where the focus was at the time. It wasn't really on staying out there for long or preparing for changing conditions. The phones were already in hand before they fully left the vehicle and remained active throughout the walk. They were used continuously lifted, lowered, and repositioned, shaping, pacing, and framing as they moved through the canyon. The pattern that developed was not steady hiking, but repeated stopping, adjusting angles, and recording short segments before continuing forward. Nothing in what they brought or how it was used accounted for sustained exposure to extreme heat. The focus remained on capturing the environment as it appeared, not on mitigating the conditions it created. About 15 minutes into the hike, they met the only other people they would see on the trail that day. A retired couple from Nevada, experienced desert hikers, were heading back toward the trailhead. They later told investigators they immediately noticed Kayla and Brianna were moving slowly, frequently stopping, and already showing clear signs of strain in the heat. The girls were also pausing along the trail to film short clips, repositioning themselves, adjusting angles, and capturing moments of the canyon rather than maintaining a steady hiking pace. After a brief exchange about the conditions, the couple continued on and left the trail shortly after, seeing no one else on their way out. Experienced hikers note this aligns with early-stage heat strain rather than immediate collapse. Early indicators are often subtle, including reduced walking pace, unnecessary pauses, and slower responses to conversation. These signs can appear while the person still feels cognitively normal. In the initial phase, heat stress may not be perceived as distress, increasing the risk of continued exposure instead of retreat. Their pauses started getting longer once they reached the more exposed sections of trail, and instead of steady hiking, sudden, it shifted into a stop-and-go rhythm. By the time they got to the natural bridge formation, that pattern had already fully taken over. The canyon narrowed there and offered some shade, but not enough to really take the edge off the exposure. The rock walls had been absorbing heat for days, and were still pushing it back into the narrow space, so even though the light softened, the air didn't actually feel any cooler. Kayla stayed at the bridge for a while longer, filming in a more deliberate, structured way, instead of just moving through it. The phone remained in use throughout, shifting between wide shots, close framing, and views through the arch, with no interruption for rest or reassessment. Brianna was present throughout, sometimes in front of the camera, and sometimes operating it herself, continuing to document rather than pausing.
I keep thinking about that couple's reaction here. They didn't overthink it, they didn't dramatize it, they just looked back at what was in front of them and quietly made the call to leave. In a place like this, that kind of simple judgment actually matters more than people realize.
During this time, Brianna finished the remaining water in her bottle. Once it was empty, there was no opportunity to refill it, as the trail offered no water sources at any point. By the time they left the bridge and continued deeper into the canyon, their total remaining water supply was minimal, and they were moving further into sustained exposure with no shade, no hydration source, and no indication that conditions were improving. The maintained trail ends at the bridge, marked by a sign indicating that anything beyond it is unmaintained canyon terrain. The canyon continues regardless, narrowing, deepening, and becoming more enclosed as the walls rise and the footing grows looser and less defined. There is no physical barrier preventing further movement, only the absence of maintenance and guidance. Beyond the bridge, the environment creates a misleading shift in perception. The higher canyon walls reduce direct overhead sun in places, and the enclosed space can feel marginally cooler at first exposure. But the thermal conditions do not actually improve. The rock faces continue to radiate stored heat, and the reduced airflow inside the canyon limits any real dissipation.
I've seen this kind of shift before in environments like this, the moment where reduced sunlight gets mistaken for reduced danger. But the heat doesn't actually ease up, it just changes how it's delivered.
The result is not relief, but a different form of sustained heat load, less direct, more trapped. Brianna continued past the sign behind Kayla. She followed the same pattern she had been in since the start. Kayla moved first, framed the moment, and set the direction. Brianna adjusted, supported, and often occupied the frame herself. Decisions about where to go and what to capture were effectively made through Kayla's movement and pacing, and Brianna's role remained responsive rather than leading. As they moved deeper, the behavior that had started as casual documenting became more continuous. Stops were no longer just pauses for rest, but repeated moments of repositioning, changing angles, redoing shots, adjusting framing, and reattempting short clips as the canyon kept changing visually around them. Movement and filming started to overlap until there was barely any separation between traveling and producing content. They eventually progressed several hundred meters beyond the maintained section before stopping for an extended period. By that point, their movement had slowed significantly, and the rhythm of hiking had been replaced almost entirely by intermittent filming and short pauses that grew longer each time they stopped. At some point in this stretch, Brianna lowered herself onto a flat rock surface and did not immediately stand again. At this stage, physiological strain typically transitions from performance degradation to system-level failure progression. The distinction between fatigue and heat injury becomes increasingly blurred from an external perspective, as both present as slowed movement and prolonged rest. However, in extreme environmental heat, rest does not function as recovery. The absence of cooling mechanisms means that metabolic heat continues to accumulate even during inactivity, particularly when surrounding surfaces remain hot enough to radiate energy back into the body. She remained out of active motion while Kayla continued further ahead, still filming portions of the canyon walls and looking deeper into the narrowing terrain. By this point, their responses to the heat were no longer unfolding in exactly the same way. Brianna appeared to be slowing first, spending longer periods stationary, and no longer matching Kayla's movement through the canyon. Kayla, meanwhile, continued pushing forward despite showing signs of impairment herself.
That's something I find particularly unsettling about severe heat illness. It doesn't always stop people immediately. A person can still be moving and making decisions while their ability to judge the situation is quietly and slowly getting worse.
Whatever was happening between them at that point, the available evidence suggests they did not leave the area together. The human body keeps its core temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it mainly relies on sweating and evaporation to cool itself down. Under normal conditions, that system works pretty well because the air around you is usually cooler than your skin, so heat can actually move away from the body. But in places where the air temperature goes above skin temperature, which can happen pretty regularly in Death Valley during peak summer, that whole balance flips. Instead of releasing heat, the body starts to take it in from the environment. Sweating still happens, but whether it actually helps depends completely on how fast that moisture can evaporate.
I usually think of it as the point where the body's cooling system is still trying to do its job, but the environment isn't really cooperating anymore.
In extreme desert heat, sweat evaporates rapidly, accelerating dehydration without providing meaningful cooling. As fluid levels drop, sweat production diminishes, and the body's ability to regulate temperature collapses further. Once that process begins, core temperature can rise quickly, and heat illness can progress into heat stroke in a relatively short period under sustained exposure. The progression of heat illness in conditions like this usually isn't something a person notices right away. Early on, it shows up in small ways: slower movement, more frequent stops, and kind of a narrowing of focus that's easy to miss in the moment. Thinking doesn't just stop, but it starts to feel less flexible without you really realizing it. So even when it would still be possible to slow down, turn back, or look for shade, that adjustment often doesn't happen simply because the impairment hasn't fully registered yet. Based on the reconstruction of phone data, movement patterns, and final known positions, Kayla and Brianna likely began attempting to return toward the trailhead after an extended period beyond the maintained trail. By that point, they had only a minimal amount of water remaining between them and were still several tenths of a mile from the car. Ambient temperatures were near their peak, and the ground surface remained intensely hot under direct sun. Their movement back was slower and less continuous than their initial ascent, marked by reduced pacing and longer pauses between stretches of walking. Between the bridge and the trailhead, the environment stays completely exposed the entire way back. The return walk from roughly 0.85 miles out would normally take a healthy adult about 15 to 20 minutes on relatively even ground, but the natural bridge trail is not even terrain. It is loose gravel, scattered rock, and uneven transitions in elevation that are manageable at baseline but become increasingly significant under physiological strain. As heat illness progresses, the problem is no longer just endurance, it becomes coordination. Foot placement becomes less precise. Small changes in grade require more effort than the body can reliably produce. What would normally be minor adjustments turn into repeated interruptions in movement. In extreme heat, the body is failing to cool itself, and it may gradually lose the cognitive and motor control needed to correct for that failure. Sweating likely began to diminish significantly during this return phase. Once sweat production drops off in sustained high heat, it is not a sign of recovery, it is a sign that the system is no longer able to regulate temperature. From that point, core temperature rises without a meaningful counterbalance. The environment offered no mitigation. Between the bridge and the trailhead, there is no water, no shade, and no shelter, and during that entire window, no other hikers entered the trail. The parking area remained quiet, and the vehicle they arrived in stayed in place, unattended and unremarked upon for hours.
What always sticks with me here is how normal everything would still look from the outside. An empty trail, a parked car, and no obvious sign that anything inside that stretch was going wrong.
At that point, the body is no longer regulating temperature in a reliable way, and performance starts breaking down in uneven stages rather than all at once. Early signs may have included slowed movement, intermittent pauses, and reduced awareness of pace and direction. In this state, decision-making often becomes unreliable, and the distinction between rest and continuation begins to blur. At a certain point in this progression, movement typically becomes inconsistent, short bursts of walking, followed by longer periods of stillness. Whether they experienced any final sustained attempt to continue is unknown. What is documented is where their movement ultimately ceased. The afternoon in Death Valley continued in the same sustained, unbroken heat that defines midsummer in the basin. Air temperatures peaked near 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the surrounding area, and the exposed valley floor held even higher surface heat where sunlight struck directly. With no cloud cover and minimal wind, there was little variation in conditions, only continuous, radiating heat held between the mountains. No hikers came onto the natural bridge trail during that stretch, so the canyon just kind of stayed the same, quiet, still, and untouched. The trail, the rock around it, even the parking area didn't really change at all. The silver Civic was still sitting in the pullout the whole time, exactly where they left it, untouched and unattended. At that point in the afternoon, conditions in the valley had begun to ease only in the most technical sense. The air temperature had dropped slightly from its peak, but the environment remained dangerously hot by any standard, with surfaces still retaining and radiating heat from hours of full sun exposure. The canyon system itself held that heat longer, its rock walls acting as slow-releasing thermal mass even as direct solar intensity began to soften.
Personally, I don't put much weight on the fact that the peak temperature has passed. Everything around them was still hot, and that's what mattered.
The camera kept being used, but less frequently, with longer gaps between recordings and more time spent stationary. The last recorded moments captured only fragments of the canyon, brief, unsteady clips of rock, light, and movement through tight space before the pattern of filming stopped altogether. After that point, there was no further documented activity from either of them that day. By the final segment of their movement through the canyon, coordination between pace and decision-making had likely become inconsistent. Movement patterns in this phase of heat illness often shift away from continuous travel into fragmented intervals, short periods of walking, interrupted by longer stops that are no longer strictly voluntary recovery points, but responses to physical limitation. In such a state, group synchronization also tends to break down, with individuals no longer maintaining shared pacing or mutual awareness in a reliable way. The family from southern Utah came onto the trail pretty calmly, like it was just another short walk they'd done before. Nothing about it really felt urgent to them at the time. The route was short, familiar, and the kind of thing they'd normally be able to handle without thinking too much about it. They only went a little ways in before the father stopped. Something up ahead caught his attention and kind of broke that steady rhythm of walking. He went forward on his own to take a closer look, then almost immediately turned back and told the rest of the family to stay put right there. Kayla Renee Durst was found on the trail, unresponsive and face down, approximately within sight of the trailhead. She was no longer in motion and showed no visible signs of responsiveness. One hand was extended forward, still loosely holding a phone that had likely entered thermal shutdown. Her footwear showed signs of extreme thermal stress, consistent with prolonged contact with hot ground, including partial separation of the sole from the sandal structure. This type of failure is conditional, resulting from the combination of extreme ground temperatures, the abrasive nature of the canyon gravel, and the material stress of repeated foot strikes under physiological strain. She had no visible supplies remaining. The family withdrew immediately without going deeper into the canyon, unaware another person had entered the area with Kayla. They returned to the parking lot and contacted emergency services after initial signal instability, reporting an unresponsive individual on the trail. They remained at the trailhead as instructed while awaiting responders.
I keep thinking about that moment with the father. The fact that he didn't try to explain it or even process it out loud with them. He just saw enough in those few seconds and made the call to stop everything.
Furnace Creek Rangers arrived later that afternoon, followed by County EMS. A staged entry protocol was used due to extreme heat conditions before a team proceeded on foot into the canyon. Kayla was located first approximately 800 feet from the trailhead and was declared deceased shortly after assessment. Search personnel later located Brianna Solano deeper along the route near a natural bridge formation in a collapsed seated position beside an empty water container. Both individuals showed no signs of trauma or animal involvement, only severe heat-related injury consistent with hyperthermia. Both individuals were confirmed deceased at the scene, with investigators determining that death had occurred hours before discovery. Both deaths were classified as environmental hyperthermia caused by extreme heat exposure. Autopsies confirmed no underlying medical conditions and negative toxicology. Investigators concluded contributing factors included inadequate water, unsuitable footwear for ground temperatures, lack of shade, and insufficient environmental preparation. The canyon remained open afterward under continued heat advisories, with officials emphasizing the outcome as the result of cumulative environmental and behavioral factors leading to rapid physiological collapse under extreme desert heat. The medical examiner's autopsies confirmed hyperthermia as the cause of death in both individuals. Park authorities' review and incident reconstruction aligned with these findings, and the case was formally closed as an environmental heat-related fatality with no enforcement actions taken.